Chapter 338. Area 232. 938, 26 has been lost. Simulated Support Team 1 has been wiped out. Red Team's command post has retreated 3 kilometers to the right of the Yellow Mountain Ridge. In the underground military exercise command hall of the base, the staff officers of the headquarters of the 1st Military Region were walking back and forth, retrieving data for feedback. Then, they would use the work platform to perform complicated calculations, turning the real-time situation of the exercise site into a visual image and displaying it on a large holographic screen. The satellite controlled by the Federation's charter computer was faithfully superimposing these images with the real-world map, creating a world full of blood and smoke. These were all simulated data streams, but when displayed on the holographic screen, they turned into dazzling blocks of color. It was especially shocking. The staff officer who kept reporting the current situation had a dull and monotonous voice. It was like the voice of a synthetic robot. There was no change in his emotions. One reason was because staff officers needed to be calm. 2. In the eyes of everyone in the command hall, the failure of Red Team was already a fact of life. The impromptu military exercise had already been going on for 17 minutes. The Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion, which was under the command of Shimon Jin, had played the role of Blue Team. From the start of the exercise, they had given everyone a huge shock. In the plan of the exercise, Blue Team, which was supposed to play the role of being attacked by the mechas, suddenly turned out in full force. Their mobile firepower fiercely attacked the valley between the two mountain ranges, catching Red Team off guard. Red Team, which was under the command of Ju Yu and the other military cadets, suffered a huge loss at the start. Although they tried their best and even tried their best to launch counterattacks from every small angle, they were still unable to change the situation of being gradually surrounded. The Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion perfectly executed Shimon Jin's command plan. They used a seemingly simple strategy change to achieve excellent results. It had to be said that to be able to complete such a large-scale change in the darkness before dawn, this unit's training level and combat ability had reached a new level. Shimon Jin is not bad. Who said that we have to stay in the barracks obediently? Although these military cadets have been to the front lines before, they have never been the commanding officer of a unit. Especially Ju Yu, who is in charge of the specific command this time. I heard that he just graduated from No. 1 Academy. In the quiet and solemn command hall, General Myers sat on the sofa with no expression on his face. He drank a cup of hot tea and said to Minister Zhu beside him, but the Red Team reacted quickly. These officers were able to hold on for more than 10 minutes in this situation. Young people are really brave. I can see that their commanding skills are quite good. Minister of Zhu Yingxing nodded and looked at the holographic screen with a serious expression. The cup of tea beside him was still steaming, and he didn't even take a sip. The unit that was supposed to be on the defensive had chosen to attack in a cold and ruthless manner. This didn't violate the rules of the drill. However, the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion was able to consecutively attack 3 key areas of the military cadets' side in an extremely short period of time. This wasn't entirely due to the lack of preparation on the part of the military cadets. It was because this unit had truly achieved the combat style of a mountain collapsing when they moved. Commander Shimon Jin's orders were clear, concise, and powerful. His troops were also very used to this kind of fighting style. Their ability to make use of the terrain and surpass the terrain was indescribably powerful. They had truly pushed the mobility of a fully automated mechanic to the extreme. In front of such an iron-blooded army, the data simulated by the Federation's central computer was obviously nothing. The Joint Chiefs of Staff was most concerned about the performance of the MX mecha. However, in the face of the sharp attacks of the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion, their hands and feet were completely tied. Minister Zhu looked at the light screen indifferently, and a faint sense of shock arose in his heart. Who would have thought that the commander named Shimon Jin would actually place the thermal activation band monitoring equipment at the forefront of the battlefield, and not at the most crucial command center? Moreover, this person had actually turned the armored vehicles, which were originally loaded with electromagnetic beam bombs, into countless explosive packs that would explode with a single trigger. They then charged toward the military officer's front line. Currently, The most effective weapon against mecha was the electromagnetic beam bomb. Perhaps the MX mecha's mobility was enough to mitigate most of the damage, but even an ace pilot would feel fear when he saw that the area he had to pass through was filled with these things. At the 212, 453 front line, if the Iron 7th Division's determination to advance had been delayed by even a second, the MX mecha on the military cadet side would have been able to pass through this checkpoint. However, at this time, this checkpoint was blocked by the Iron 7th Division without any fear of death. The battle situation on the holographic screen was very tragic. Although the red team under the command of Officer Sheng was already showing signs of defeat, those troops were still valiantly defending every line under their command. It was indeed a siege, because although their command center had tactically retreated 3 kilometers, according to the way both sides were fighting without regard for their lives, in the end, it would only lead to them being trapped and then completely annihilated. Ju Yu and the military cadets' command was not too big of a problem, but after all, they were commanding a virtual army. On the other hand, the defense battalion of the Iron 7th Division was made up of real people. Only soldiers had the soul of a soldier, and could unleash power greater than what was calculated by the computer. In the face of such a force, even the most desperate resistance seemed to be futile. Minister Zhu rubbed his forehead tiredly. He had not slept for a night, so he was a little tired. However, this tiredness came from the drill site. If the command center and electronic command network were destroyed, even if the 8MX mecha could escape the threat of the Iron 7th Division's electromagnetic beam bombs, how would they be able to find the enemy's command center? How would they be of any use? It seemed that the far-reaching intentions of the federal military still could not be realized. He took a sip of the thick tea and frowned. He thought to himself that choosing the Iron 7th Division as the side for the drill was probably the wrong choice. However, if the MX had not shocked the hearts of the Federation's ace troops during the drill, how would those stubborn generals be willing to change their command strategy? In comparison, Shimen Jin's tactical command strategy was more suitable for the MX mecha. If the 8MX mecha had been on the defense battalion of the Iron 7th Division, the battle would have probably ended long ago. With this thought, Minister Zhu put down his teacup and subconsciously glanced to his right. On the sofa on the far right of the first row of the drill command hall, the commander of the Iron 7th Division, Du Shaoqing, still had a cold expression on his face. Just like during the day, he did not seem to care about the development of the drill. His head was lowered and he was resting, but his sunglasses were missing. Commander Du Shaoqing kept everyone at arm's length and was confident that he did not care about the progress of the drill. However, there were many senior military officers in the command hall who were concerned about this tragic and somewhat helpless drill. They were impressed by the commanding ability of the cadets, but what shocked them even more was the battle prowess of the Iron 7th Division and the extremely calm command of the commander. Nonsense! General Miles roared with a gloomy expression. This chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was the same as Minister Zhu. What he was most concerned about was the performance of the MX mecha in the drill. Right then, he saw the screen displaying that the red team had scattered all 8 MX mecha, as if trying to break them up into smaller groups and forcefully cross the 212. 453 line. He could no longer control his emotions and slammed his hand down on the coffee table, causing the tea in his cup to spill out. The orderlies hurried over to clean up. General Miles took off the button on his collar and pointed at the screen. He loudly reprimanded, "The electromagnetic beam is a damn thing, but how can we have time to dodge it? By the time the mechas get away, our base camp will be completely wiped out." The federal military had already come to a certain conclusion after numerous experiments on the MX mecha. This revolutionary new mecha, once fully displayed its mobility, was incomparably powerful. However, under Shimen Jin's precise command, the defense battalion of the Iron 7th Division had already lured the 8MX mecha into the most unfavorable terrain. Still trying to fish in troubled waters at this time? They will only be destroyed by the division, General Miles reprimanded darkly. Once they are captured by electronic surveillance, they will be trapped in the terrain and have to face continuous attacks. How can they survive? If they were to support each other, these 8MX mecha would at least contain all of the M-series mecha and half of the self-propelled artillery systems of the Iron 7th Division. He took a deep breath and forcefully suppressed the anger in his heart. He said coldly, "I saw that Ju Yu's command was not bad at all. How could he have made such a stupid mistake?" Minister Zhu smiled slightly and said, "I'm afraid it was Shula's idea." Admiral Miles was stunned. A faint bitter smile flashed across his slightly red wrinkles due to excitement. The development of the drill was just as the general had predicted. In order to cover the 8MX mecha's dispersal, the military officers' command center launched the last virtual airdrop. However, they had no choice but to choose the airdrop location to be in a valley. In the end, they were completely surrounded. On the other hand, Shimon Jin, who was commanding the Iron 7 Division's guards, coldly maintained their military positions in all directions. They carefully deployed their forces, neither too fast nor too slow. However, they stared fiercely at the 7MX mechas. A few shorekill encirclements gradually formed near the light spots that represented the MX mechas. They were filled with killing intent. Once the encirclement formed by the self-propelled artillery and the mecha was completed, no matter how strong the MX mecha were, they would not be able to last for long in this kind of rugged, hilly terrain in the middle of the night without any firepower support. The people in the military exercise command center looked at the screen with a sorrowful and emotional gaze. The MX mecha relied on their mobility to force their way out of the encirclement. However, not long after, they were forcefully surrounded by the indifferent soldiers of the Iron 7th Division. They were surrounded again and divided into a few lonely circles. The clear tactic of the Iron 7th Division was gradually showing its power. However, strangely, Shimon Jin did not use the unmanned cruise missile position that the central mainframe had deployed. Was it because he did not want to use it, or was there another reason? The people in the military exercise command center were guessing Shimon Jin's intentions. They were calculating the time when the red team would fail. At this time, Du Shaoqing finally stopped resting. He slowly raised his head and looked at the progress on the screen. His indifferent face was still expressionless. The hand holding the lambskin glove gradually relaxed. Number 1 MX main cannon has failed. Damage integration is at 17%. Number 3 MX component has been destroyed. Number 7 MX has entered electronic shielding mode. Other than the normal data of the damaged system, all communications are cut off. Unable to locate. The red team has released an electronic interference method. The band level is Gamma level 3. According to calculations, within 2 hours, all the red team's electronic interference equipment will not be able to be activated again due to overload. The calm voice of the staff officer finally caused a small fluctuation in the military exercise command center. Everyone noticed that a MX mecha on the screen had suddenly disappeared. The red team has used all their electronic interference. What are they betting on? General Miles frowned slightly and whispered to himself, the MX is in a self-shielding state. It is not easy for the Iron 7th Division to discover it. However, the pilot can no longer receive any signals. Doesn't that mean he has become blind and mute? He shook his head and said, is this MX trying to learn from a blind cat that has found a dead mouse? Is he trying to break into the blue team's command center by wandering around in the mountains? After saying this, General Miles and the other generals around him couldn't help but laugh out loud, and the atmosphere in the field eased a little. Bring up the real-time satellite image. General Miles frowned and said, I want to see what this pilot is planning to do. Is he planning to find a big cave and hide there until the end of the exercise? Half a minute later, a staff officer reported with an unpleasant expression, Commander, there is a delay in the satellite image. The mecha's movement after blocking the signal was too fast. We are unable to locate it for the time being. Hearing this, the generals sitting in the first row of the military exercise command center were suddenly interested. They all thought of a person's name. Probably only that person could operate a mecha that could reach such a speed. Du Shaoqing, who was sitting on the sofa on the far right, was expressionless. A hint of interest flashed through his eyes. He thought to himself, what else can Shula do in this situation? Shula was not doing anything. Right now, he was panting heavily in the dimly lit cockpit. He was anxiously observing his surroundings through the infrared search equipment and visual ray capture system. He did not even have time to wipe away the sweat that was dripping down his forehead. From the start, they had never thought that they would be able to defeat Iron 7 Division's trump card in a direct confrontation. Everything was only because of Ju Yu and the other officers' trust in him. The red team had sacrificed a lot. Even 7MX Mecha had fallen into the merciless encirclement of Iron 7 Division. Only then had they found an opportunity for Shula to hide. The mountains were in the darkest moment before dawn. In the distance, there were faint flashes of white light. Although the sound of explosions could not be heard, the feeling of being filled with blood and fire constantly drifted in the valley. He knew that Ju Yu and the other officers in the command center were not having a good time. All of their manpower had been invested in the battle on the west side of the Yellow Mountain Ridge. In fact, because most of the command center was virtual combat power, most of the officers were even willing to use themselves as staff officers. It was also because of the stubborn resistance of these officers, the cover of the 7MX Mecha, and even the 18 men of Iron 7 Division, that Shula was able to find an opening on the battlefield and sneak in. The red team's last and most intense electronic interference attack was to cover for his breakthrough. Shula brought up the electronic map on the screen and looked at it carefully. Unfortunately, even at the last moment before they blocked themselves and cut off all electronic communication, the officers still could not find the location of Iron 7 Division's command center. Shimin Jin was very similar to Du Shaoqing. He did not reveal any loopholes at all. Thinking of these two names, Shula felt a chill in his heart. A shadow flashed across his eyes. He knew that Iron 7 Division was an invincible division in the Federation's military exercises. However, only when he was on the battlefield and saw with his own eyes this meticulous, calm, and machine-like, ferocious, beast-like force, could he truly understand how terrifying they were. This battle was too tragic. The Iron 7 Division was indeed ferocious. Even though there was only one battalion participating today, they still fought with the resentment and murderous spirit they had accumulated over the years. Their sharpness was unstoppable and indescribably cold. The tiger in the West Woods had suppressed Du Shaoqing for 10 years, but Du Shaoqing had successfully transformed this emotion into the temperament or soul of an army. Once it was displayed on the battlefield, it was truly terrifying. Moreover, the commander named Shimin Jin was indeed very outstanding. The 18 men of Iron 7 Division who had protected him when they entered the mountain area were indeed able to erupt with power that even Shula praised. However, even though they had killed more than 40 enemies, they were all killed in the end. In front of the ruthless Iron 7 Division, the strength of this small group was mercilessly crushed into powder. Not even a speck of dust was left behind. At this moment, Shula had to admit that Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7 Division had the right to be proud. His bodyguard, Du Shaoqing, was already so fierce. What if Du Shaoqing was personally in command? After a few deep breaths, he calmed down. After confirming that the electronic shielding system was working properly, he quickly keyed in commands with the fingers of his right hand. His left hand gently pushed the control stick, and the black MX Mecha glided to the right in the dense forest. The heavy body of the mecha did not make any noise that would have woken Squirrel. It looked more like a ghost. Under the self-shielding system, the MX Mecha did not emit any signals other than the visible and infrared devices. It was also unable to receive any signals. The small semi-aperture radar and SSC search system were also forced to shut down. Right now, the mecha he was operating was like a moving rock. It could not see into the distance, nor could it hear any good news carried by the wind. The cadets did not buy much time for him. Once the command center and the 7MX mechas were destroyed, the Iron 7 Division's defense battalion would retreat. He would not have any more chances. In this tense moment where every second counted, Shula did not move. Instead, he closed his eyes. A rock would not always be upright. There were times when it was crazy, and there were times when it was shameless. Shula thought of the chilling aura emanating from Du Shaoqing's body. He thought of what he had seen with his own eyes. He thought of his comrades being utterly defeated by the Iron 7 Division. His hair stood on end. Not only did he have to complete the difficult mission given to him by the military, but also because of the murderous intent that Du Shaoqing had revealed. In the future, If he had to constantly worry about a famous general behind him trying to eliminate him on the battlefield in the Westwoods, it would not be a good life. Therefore, Shula decided to win this exercise at all costs. He had to suppress the arrogance of the Iron 7 Division. So, he decided to cheat. He closed his eyes and stared into the deep darkness. He listened to the smooth and low sounds coming from the cockpit. He said in his heart, "Old thing, I need you to show me the way." There was no response. His mind was blank. There was no white light. There was nothing. This blank state did not last long, but to Shula, it felt as long as a century. The glory of the Charter was his biggest support in the Federation. It was his biggest secret. Even Uncle Lou would not have guessed such a bizarre thing. However, this was also his biggest fear. He did not understand why the old thing would help him. He also did not know when the old thing would abandon him or even arrest him. 7 seconds. Cold sweat dampened the simulation system on his skin. Shula finally heard a voice that was usually abnormally old-fashioned. Today, however, it was exceptionally pleasant to the ear. "What is it this time?" Chapter 339. Hearing this sentence, all the pores on Shula's skin opened at the same time. The cold sweat on his skin seemed to turn into mist and dissipated in an instant, leaving behind only a sense of comfort. The reason why he had such a strong feeling was because the previous 7 seconds of silence made him very frightened. The far-flung the glory of the Charter relied on countless aircraft, satellites, ground electronic monitoring networks, and even all the chips used by the government to build a giant network that would never have any gaps. In the past, when Shula wanted to actively contact the Great Existence through this network, there was never any delay. The other party was like a god that would answer all his requests, always by his side. He needed to delay for a period of time before he could contact the other party. This was something he had never experienced before. It was just that in the tragic and tense military exercise site, Shula didn't have enough energy to capture this strange phenomenon and arouse enough vigilance. He just subconsciously felt that the first sentence that the old thing said today was a little different. "Help me find a person, Iron 7th Division Lieutenant Colonel Shimon Jin." Looking at the grid in his left eye, Shula quickly said. The Federal Central Computer wouldn't always appear in his retina with the face of an old butler. Sometimes, it was just some relatively simple and boring lines. He didn't know what kind of algorithm the Federal Central Computer represented. In the Fox Fortress Black Dungeon, Shula had a lot of conversations with the computer of the Bureau of Proclamation. He was already familiar with and used to this mode of communication in his mind, so even though he knew that the other party was operating a cold and mechanical program, he always felt like he was talking to an old butler. This goes against the Charter. Without hearing the complete sentence, Shula said in his mind, "It's not like you haven't done it before. Although until today, I still don't understand what kind of virus is in your computer to make it go crazy." "You know what I'm doing right now," Shula quickly said to the grid of light dots in his mind, "just treat it as a game. After all, it's not like the last time in the building where I need you to help me kill someone." The old man was silent for a long time. Suddenly, there was a change in his voice as he said, "Since it's a game, why don't I just change the data and kill all of the enemy's simulated troops? Then, I'll send you 2 armies." In the cockpit, Shula was startled. He lifted the light screen goggles on his eyes. Only then did he remember that a large portion of the simulated firepower in today's military exercise was simulated and distributed by the Charter computer. Hearing the old man's suggestion, he couldn't help but be a little dumbfounded. He said, "Even if you want to cheat, you should have some professional ethics. You have to leave a way out for others." Because of this shock, he once again missed the opportunity to notice the old thing's abnormality today. It was obvious that the computer program in the depths of the Bureau of Proclamation was very mischievous today. Shula's left eye could see ghosts and people that he couldn't see before. It was like an omniscient and omnipotent radar. However, beyond his own body and even the mecha outside of his body, through the chip behind his neck, he was connected to the Charter of the universe. This was his biggest secret. In the darkness before dawn, when the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion was about to win the military exercise, he decided to use this ability that made him feel a little scared and wanted to avoid it. The other end of the black dream fell silent again. The fine light dots condensed into a grid and simulated a three-dimensional map. It was transmitted into his brain and appeared on his retina. If he wanted to, and the old man agreed, he could even peek at the First Lady taking a bath. At this time, it wasn't very difficult to find the calm Lieutenant Colonel Shimon Jin in the middle of the mountains. If he found Shimon Jin, he would find the headquarters of the Iron 7th Division. Turning off all of the mecha's detection equipment, Shula stared at the holographic screen in front of him with his naked eyes. He controlled the black MX mecha and moved silently through the forest. Following the map points in his eyes, he gradually approached his target. His eyes grew brighter and brighter, like a wolf shooting out the light of its prey in the dark forest. After the MX mecha's automatic electronic shielding, it became a rock in the dark night. Regardless of whether it was the heat it emitted or the electromagnetic wave that leaked out from the dual engines, it was all carefully designed and controlled within an extremely small range. The problem was that the MX in this state had a huge disadvantage: it had lost all of its detection equipment. It could only hide but not launch a surprise attack. However, Shula, who was controlling the MX, was able to make up for this disadvantage. At 6:13 a.m., a faint ray of light appeared on the horizon, but the surroundings were still pitch black. There were no sounds of birds or insects in the forest, only bursts of light coming from the direction of the Yellow Mountains in the distance. It looked like the troops commanded by Ju Yu and those military cadets were still making their last stand. After capturing the location of the Iron 7th Division's headquarters, Shula used more than 10 minutes to control the Black MX. Like a ghost, under the cover of the night, he used his superb control skills to silently climb over 2 steep mountain peaks and approach the enemy's camp. Along the way, although the heavy mecha couldn't avoid crushing a few rocks and making some noise, startling the 2 sleeping eagles, the mecha still managed to successfully hide from the Iron 7th Division's strict electronic surveillance equipment under its automatic electronic shielding state. The Black MX mecha arrived at the peak of Blue Lake. In front of it was a steep slope, and below it was the command camp of the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion. Looking from afar in the darkness, there were only a few dim lights in the camp, so it was impossible to see how much firepower was hidden. In the mecha, Shula frowned as he carefully analyzed the terrain and the enemy's defenses. He knew that stealth would stop here. If the 2 sides got any closer, they would no longer be within the range of the electronic shielding battle. The Black MX mecha's body would be visible to the naked eye. That old thing's earlier words could only be taken as a joke. If the central computer really did suddenly kill all of Blue Team's virtual troops and then transferred 2 divisions worth of troops to Red Team, how could the military exercise continue? Finding the enemy's headquarters was already cheating, but to actually break through the enemy's headquarters and obtain victory in this military exercise, Shula had to do it himself. Still haven't found it. In the military exercise command hall, General Miles had a dark expression on his face as he unceremoniously reprimanded the staff officers around him. That MX mecha had already disappeared for a long time. The intense battle at the front line of the Lonely Ridge at Yellow Mountain Ridge had already reached its end, but in the end, the command hall still had not been able to pull up the image of that MX mecha. This sort of information-gathering ability naturally did not satisfy him. Found it. A military staff officer suddenly stood up from behind the workbench and said excitedly, "We found it just now, but there was a delay in the data. The satellite image was only pulled up now." "Then hurry up and show it," General Miles said in a low voice. There were 30 or so large screens in the command hall, and 7 of them showed a circular moving image. In the extremely dark background of the image, only the faint silhouette of a black mecha could be seen. It was running non-stop in the mountains behind the base, leaping and running at an extremely fast speed. "Is that Shula?" General Miles frowned as he turned to ask Minister Zhu. Zhu Yingxing's brow was also furrowed, and he said, "Should be. Where is he going? He hasn't slowed down at all." General Miles couldn't quite guess the intentions of that black mecha. Could it be that he knows where 7th Division's headquarters is? Zhu Yingxing shook his head. It's clearly in a completely shielded state. Both sides' public satellite signals can't be received, so how can he find it? Just as the two military bigwigs were whispering to each other, the military exercise command hall gradually quieted down. All of the high-ranking generals and staff officers in charge of the exercise planning had their eyes firmly glued to the silhouette of the MX mecha on the screen. The image taken by the military's precision satellite was very clear, and due to the angle of the lighting, the black mecha that had been running along the mountain ridge was faintly shrouded in a layer of faint light. Facing the rugged, weathered rock face of the mountain, this black mecha was actually running so fast. Whether it was leaping or zigzagging, it had no intention of slowing down. Moreover, looking at the analysis of the dust when the mecha's feet landed on the ground, it was likely that even the sound of the landing would not be too loud. Could this be the true form of the MX mecha? But no matter how advanced the MX mecha was, to be able to run along the mountains at such a high speed and with such stability and serenity, it could only rely on the pilot's superb control skills. In the hands of this pilot, the black mecha's movements were clear and concise, light and agile, exuding an indescribable sense of wonder and beauty. It far surpassed the impression that the average military ace pilot left on others. Who was this pilot? The military exercise command hall was silent. Everyone's eyes were glued to the screen, to the black mecha on the screen, walking silently on the other side of the mountain ridge. Du Shaoqing had been sitting quietly on the sofa on the far right. Even when the entire hall was in awe of the black MX mecha's silence, he was still unusually calm and cool, not a ripple in his heart. When General Miles and Minister Zhu had thought of the identity of that pilot, he had already determined that the person in the black mecha could only be Xu Le, for someone who could be chosen by the Federation's military god. If he could not display an extraordinary level of strength, then he would actually be a little disappointed. His right hand held the black lambskin glove lightly as he looked coldly at the black mecha on the screen. It was advancing like a leopard cat, as if it had completely escaped the shackles of gravity. A hint of interest flashed through his deep eyes. Running like this, could it be that he would be able to find his troops in the mountains? Although the specific commander of this impromptu military exercise was Shiman Jin, Du Shaoqing still only thought that this was his troops, and they could not be defeated. On the wide screen, only a black MX mecha could be seen moving forward at full speed, running, jumping, and moving freely and silently among the mountains. The image was a little dull, but what was strange was that even if the two military bigwigs were not watching the black mecha's figure seriously, no one would have thought of switching the screen. For everyone in the hall, this black mecha that had disappeared alone should be the winner of this military exercise. All the soldiers in the command hall who were watching the battle were inexplicably nervous and confused. The black mecha seemed to be running like a headless fly. Did it hide a hidden meaning that no one could guess? This mystery was revealed when the black mecha stopped for the first time, and also when it stopped for the last time. The black mecha felt its way to the top of a mountain and then quietly squatted down, as if preparing for something. There was a camp below the valley. What is this place? Minister Zhu asked curiously. Although the military exercise command hall was very clear about the military deployment and losses of both sides, right now, everyone's eyes had followed the black mecha for so long that they were a little confused. Blue Pool Mountain. Peak number 2. It was still that military staff officer who was in charge of information gathering. He stood up from behind the workbench and said in a trembling voice, full of disbelief. Zhu Yingxing frowned and turned to look at him. That military staff officer licked his dry lips and said in a slightly hoarse voice, "In the valley is the blue team's command center." The black mecha had run all the way through the mountains without slowing down, and in the end, it had actually bumped into the blue team's command center. At this time, of course, no one believed that this pilot had been a blind cat that had hit the mouse, a headless fly that had headed straight for the washroom, completely relying on luck. Everyone was shocked. A mecha that could not receive any signals on its own, how could it have found the blue team's command center? General Miles grunted in surprise and sat back down on the sofa. His white eyebrows raised slightly, and he seemed very satisfied. Minister Zhu's face was still calm, but he picked up the cup of tea on the coffee table and slowly took a few sips. The command hall could no longer keep quiet. Everyone began to talk in private, and the buzzing sound was accompanied by feelings of shock, filling the entire underground space. Du Shaoqing looked at the screen in shock. Even he did not know where Shimon Jin would put the command center, so he had been calm before, but who would have thought that that guy would actually find it? His expression was cold, and 2 dark clouds appeared in his eyes. A major of the Iron 7th Division walked to his side and whispered a few words in his ear, then respectfully handed over the sunglasses. Du Shaoqing took the sunglasses, but did not put them on. Instead, he coldly placed them on the coffee table beside him. The major hesitated. He wanted to say a few words of advice, but looking at the commander's already cold face, in the end, he did not dare to say anything. Finding the command center does not mean you have the ability to break through the camp. Even I admire Shimon Jin's ability to set up camp. You only have 1 MX. I want to see how you can break through the camp and win. Du Shaoqing looked at the black mecha resting on the peak of the mountain on the screen, and a fierce light flashed through his deep eyes. Right at this time, a soft cry came from the command hall. It was not that the black mecha had done something amazing again, but that the first ray of sunlight from planet S1 had finally broken through the horizon and spilled onto the ground. The black MX mecha that was quietly squatting on the peak of the Blue Lake Mountain just happened to welcome the freshest sunlight. In the dim light of dawn, the black mecha bathed to its heart's content, full of solemn beauty. This scene was truly beautiful. After Du Shaoqing graduated with the highest score from the 1st Military Academy, he was assigned to the 3rd Military Region. Ignoring the military headquarters' request to cherish talent, he forcefully requested to enter the already fallen Iron 7th Division. In the Iron 7th Division, his first position was as the battalion commander of the Independent Battalion. The resurgence of the Iron 7th Division was also due to the victory of the Independent Battalion in a certain military exercise. Du Shaoqing had been promoted from battalion commander to division commander. The 1st Independent Battalion he led was also reorganized into the local defense battalion that protected the division headquarters. What the Black Mecha Shula was facing was precisely this kind of super-mechanized battalion that had a glorious tradition and powerful combat strength. In the impromptu military exercise this morning, despite the efforts of Ju Yu and the other officers, the 7th team had still been torn apart by the local defense camp. Shu Le, on the other hand, only had 1 MX mecha. Yet, he had to face the seemingly calm but definitely heavily guarded headquarters of the local defense camp. The morning light shone on the mountain peak, shining on the black mecha that was half crouched like a statue. Iron 7th Division headquarters definitely didn't expect a mecha to be able to reach their headquarters in a completely shielded state, but their commander was Shimon Jin. Just as Division Commander Du Shaoqing had praised, Shimon Jin was a very strict person. Even in this kind of highly modern simulation exercise, he still arranged for human sentries around the camp. The first person to discover the Black MX mecha was a soldier on the western sentry post. Without any warning, a sharp alarm rang through the quiet valley. The small radius precision radar began to scan wildly, trying to determine the location of the enemy. Early in the morning was the best time to launch a sneak attack, but it definitely wasn't suitable for Iron 7th Division. The exercise had only started in the early morning, so all the officers and soldiers of this division still maintained a very clear mind and spirit. From the moment they had discovered the Black MX mecha, it had only taken 3 seconds for the self-propelled cannons around the camp to aim at the peak of Blue Pond Peak under the guidance of the electronic system. With a violent roar, the cannons fired without hesitation. In an instant, the roar was so loud that the entire valley seemed to shake. Who knew how many self-firing cannons Shimon Jin had set up around the camp headquarters? These self-firing cannons were simple to equip and easy to set up. They didn't have much destructive power in the mountains, but once they were used to fire at fast targets on the slopes, they were extremely powerful. Could it be that Iron 7th Division had thought from the start that the mecha could break through the camp? Or could it be that this was an ambush? Shula didn't think too much about it. From the moment he had appeared on the peak, he had entered battle mode. It was only natural that he would be discovered by the enemy, so he didn't panic. As for what kind of defensive measures Iron 7th Division had set up around the camp headquarters, it was none of his business. He was a simple and direct person. With an axe, he would smash a future, and with a knife, he would cleave a ray of light. Right now, with the MX mecha in hand, The strength in his body was surging. Other than rushing down, he had not prepared a second battle plan for himself at all. It was precisely because of this kind of absolute heroism that the Black Mecha rushed down the steep slope from the peak. Even if it wasn't a sneak attack, it was still a sneak attack. 3 seconds later, the self-firing cannons were all aimed at the top of the Black Mecha. From this, one could see how fast the mecha was. Sitting in the cockpit, Shula stared at the holographic screen in front of him. His left eye was looking at the eye-catching row of citizen numbers in the valley camp. He felt the intense vibrations coming from the mecha, but his heart was unprecedentedly calm. Every time he entered the mecha, he would enter a very strange mental state. It was as if the mecha was the real world, while the outside world was completely isolated. There were only countless data models, moving quickly there. His left hand pushed the control stick fiercely, his right hand quickly entering commands. The simulation system was at full power, the precision instruments magnifying and correcting every tiny movement of his body, then faithfully reproduced by the Black MX mecha. Silently and sternly, the mecha charged down the mountain peak. The Black Mecha rushed down the steep slope from the peak. There was no longer any sense of lightness, only an unstoppable momentum. With every step the heavy alloy mecha took, a few pieces of rock burst out. It was as if the entire mountain peak was trembling. The huge recoil force was absorbed by the mecha's highly efficient connecting devices and spherical joints, turning into a forward momentum. Thus, with every step the Black Mecha took, its speed increased by a few notches. Under the mecha's feet, the mountain rocks cracked, like a yellow dragon in the morning light. At the end of the yellow dragon, the Black MX mecha's body was unusually cold. Its speed increased, to the point where the mecha's movement frequency could not be seen clearly. "What is he trying to do?" asked General Miles, frowning in the command hall. "Speed up," said Zhu Yingxing uncertainly, his brow also tightly furrowed. "He's going to fall to his death if he speeds up any more," said General Miles silently. With the current slope of Blue Pool Mountain, if the Black Mecha continued to speed up like this, there was no need for Iron 7th Division's concentrated artillery fire at all. He would fall to his death. However, he believed that the young man his old teacher had chosen would give him another surprise like before, so he did not say this out loud. Shimon Jin did not think that the Black Mecha charging down from the monitor would fall to his death, because even after being attacked, he still maintained the absolute calm of a commander. The other party had gone through untold hardships to find their way to his camp, definitely not to commit suicide, so he decided to send the other party on his way. Today's military exercise, the battle in the Lonely Mountains and Yellow Mountain Ridge, had been decided. Although the resistance of the officers and cadets was unexpectedly fierce, making it difficult for him to deal with, in the end, they had won. As long as they destroyed this Black Mecha, which could be either amazing or stupid, the Iron 7th Division would welcome another victory. "Fire from all directions." Shimon Jin calmly gave the order. He picked up his cup of coffee and took a sip, allowing the staff officer beside him to operate the electronic workstation. He had carefully studied all of the technical parameters of the MX mecha, so he was very clear about the terrifying movement speed and close-range combat ability of this new mecha. Thus, he was very certain that under his long-prepared all-around attack this time, that Black Mecha would definitely be hit continuously. The first round of concentrated fire from the howitzers did not even graze the side of the Black Mecha. It was as comical as setting off a round of fireworks to cheer on the Black Mecha's heroic attack. But inside the mecha, Shula was abnormally calm. The Iron 7th Division, who had won 37 consecutive military exercises, would not be flustered by his sneak attack, even though the person personally in command this time was not that cold and ruthless division commander do as expected. The reactivated MX's onboard radar and SCC search system suddenly emitted a shrill warning. Trembling violently, Shula stared at the screen and narrowed his eyes. Looking at the complex lines on the screen that represented lethality, Shula really could not understand. Could it be that Shimon Jin had guessed that he would charge down from this hillside? Otherwise, how could the opponent's battalion headquarters have perfectly repositioned all the howitzers in such a short amount of time? Or could it be that the Iron 7th Division's usual training was already at such a terrifying level? Hundreds of howitzers were already roaring towards him. Schuyler did not have much time to think. On this kind of slope, the Iron 7th Division's firepower area was precisely controlled to an oval area in front of and behind him. It was truly terrifying. The MX Mecha could withstand the howitzers head-on, but it could not withstand too many of them. Moreover, if the battle damage system determined that the damage was too severe, it could be immediately disqualified. Right then, the only thing Schuyler's Black Mecha needed to do was to dodge these densely packed horizontal grenades. However, this also seemed to be something that was completely impossible to do. No matter how great the mobility of the MX Mecha was, under such a complex barrage of firepower, even the strongest Federation pilot would find it difficult to make precise dodging. The military exercise command hall was silent. Many of the officers looked at the screen with mixed feelings. On the screen, the 200-meter radius of the slope at the foot of Blue Cake Mountain had already been plowed by the howitzers. Although they did not carry actual ammunition, those high-speed ejections had still blasted countless bits of the hard mountain rock into pieces, sending dust and smoke into the air. The high-ranking officers who were watching this military exercise were still in awe of the Black Mecha's elusive methods and heroic charge. Now, seeing Iron 7th Division's steel-like calmness and computer-like precision of calculation, they could not help but feel a chill in their hearts. In the shortest amount of time, they had made the most appropriate response. When the enemy seemed to be at their strongest, they had used the simplest of volleys to strangle this heroic attack in its cradle. "Report the damage of that mecha," General Miles said urgently. The officers in the hall were somewhat surprised. Under such concentrated firepower, did the commander still think that the mecha would be able to retain a certain amount of combat power? It should be known that this volley of howitzers by the local defense battalion of the Iron 7th Division looked simple, but in reality, the timing and area of effect had been perfect. After hearing General Miles's words, the staff officer was stunned for a moment, then hurriedly pulled up the data. When everyone in the hall saw the damage figures of the mecha, they could not help but think that the staff officer had been too flustered and gotten the numbers wrong. Not even 2% of the battle losses were achieved. General Miles's expression gradually became strange as he stared at the image magnified by the staff officer on the screen. On the screen, the Black Mecha was in the midst of the smoke and dust, amidst the hail of bullets, its entire body trembled. Countless high-speed howitzers brushed past it, making it difficult for the enemy to reach it. In an extremely dangerous situation, the Black Mecha could be hit at any time, but it relied on its incredible maneuvering to twist the body of the mecha, jumping around like a ray of black light. It was like an old willow tree that was gradually darkening in color, no matter how the wind and rain hit it, but it was always strong enough to survive. General Miles stood up abruptly. With an extremely complicated expression, he looked at the trembling figure of the Black Mecha on the screen with passion and sadness. He couldn't help but think of the past, of that old man who had brought him through life and death. Chapter 340. Not the past, not the old teacher. General Miles stood up abruptly and looked at the Black Mech on the screen with great emotion. After a while, he came back to his senses. Many years had passed since those days of war on the Empire's planet fields. The Black Mech trembled under the bombardment of grenades on the steep slopes of the Blue Pool Peak. It used its demonic high-speed body movements to avoid damage and continued to accelerate forward with a chill. Compared to the old teacher with the surname Lee, it was obvious that there was still a huge gap. He operated an MX, while the old teacher operated an M37. However, he still had not reached the level of the old teacher where he could break through obstacles alone and make the rivers give way to him. However, the two mechs that were separated by decades, whether it was the control method or the traces of movement, there were some similarities. General Miles looked at this scene and thought that he understood the real reason why the old teacher protected Schuyler so much. He couldn't help but be speechless. In reality, it only took a very short time to dodge through 17 complicated and difficult areas at high speed. The people watching the military exercise only felt that their eyes were blurred for a few seconds. The Black Mech instantly escaped the range of the grenades and broke through the smoke and dust in the valley. Like a god of death from the netherworld, it continued to rush down the mountain. Whether it was the initial sniper attack or the difficult process of avoiding the grenade firing line after that, the black mech did not slow down at all. Even every indeterminate turn and slide was completed at high speed. Seeing the speed at which the black mecha was falling towards the valley was getting faster and faster, about to become a stream of flowing black light, the spectators, who had already been shocked by the pilot's superb control skills, could not help but feel a chill run down their spines. If the speed limit was exceeded and the onboard system lost control, would this black mecha fall to pieces? They should have guessed that this pilot would be like before and would definitely be hiding many surprises. However, seeing this kind of high-speed crazy impact that was close to losing control with their own eyes, the people were still very worried. Being hit head-on by the crazy black MX mech, the headquarters of the Iron 7th Division in the valley was still calm. The invisible electric waves in the air flowed quickly. All the soldiers coldly and calmly continued with the work at hand, as if they did not see this scene. Along with the clear sound of motors, the level-firing grenade base completed its second round of automatic aiming in the shortest amount of time. Following the officer's order, the electrically controlled anti-infantry mines buried in front of the steep slope of Blue Pool Mountain exploded one after another, sending countless earth pillars into the air. Like countless fireworks, they blocked the path of the black mecha. This type of weapon, which was extremely destructive against individual soldiers and even armored vehicles, might not be able to do much damage to the sturdy MX mecha, but it could successfully interfere with the field's vision, buying the best opportunity and space for the level-firing grenade launchers. The sky full of grenades rained down again. At this time, the black mecha had already charged up 3/5 of the steep slope. Its own speed had already been raised to a terrifying level. Under such high inertia, no matter how skilled the pilot was, he would not be able to make those inconceivable dodging movements in the face of this sky full of grenades. The fire control of the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion was so precise that it was praiseworthy. They didn't panic because of the enemy's strength, and didn't hesitate because of the failure of the first wave of attacks. They quickly launched the second wave of attacks without pause, and the details were calculated very precisely. At this moment, even if the uncle was reborn, or the old man came out of seclusion, they probably would not be able to dodge such a dense barrage of attacks at such a short distance. Shula naturally would not be able to do so either. However, just as the defense battalion was firing at full power, a strange change suddenly occurred to the black mech. Amidst the rumbling of the bullets, countless crisp sounds could be clearly heard. Those were the sounds of metal colliding with metal and separating from each other. The modified main cannon on the right shoulder of the black MX mecha instantly spat out flames. Although it did not carry actual ammunition, this kind of momentum was still shocking. Even as it was falling at a high speed, to the point of almost losing its momentum, the main cannon of the black mecha still managed to successfully deal a great deal of damage to the close-range fire control formation of the local defense camp. However, the people in the command center did not have time to assess the casualties of the local defense camp. Instead, they found that the black mecha's main cannon had flown up after this round of furious fire. Like a piece of scrap metal, it whistled through the air and shot towards the group of level-firing grenade. Main cannon detached automatically. The staff officers in the command hall could no longer maintain their calm mechanical voices. They reported loudly in shock. Long-range weapon system detached automatically. Platform type cover strip detach. Hidden repair arm detach. Area 41's firmware detach. Auxiliary balancer ejected. The military staff officer's voice was urgent and shocked. However, on the steep slope in front of the command center, everything that was happening to the black mecha was happening much faster than his explanation. Following the crisp sound of metal clashing and detaching, countless heavy components were ejected from the black mecha's body. In the original design, this type of detachment had a certain initial velocity to prevent damage to the mecha itself. However, at this time, the black mecha was already descending at an almost uncontrollable speed. At the same time, the heavy components that were detached from the mecha's body were also moving at a terrifying speed. They were actually sputtering outwards without stopping. Some of the firmware was ejected into the air at high speed. Others were ejected in front of the black mecha. As the black mecha continued to descend, components were sputtering out of the mecha's body. This scene was extremely strange. It was like a solid black boulder that could not withstand the erosion of thousands of years. It fell from the mountain peak, colliding with each other and sending countless fragments flying everywhere. These splashing components were extremely fast, their mass massive, and they were immensely powerful. They battered the entire hillside into a sorry state, and for some strange reason, they even helped the black mecha block several level fire grenades that were aimed at its hard body. Was this luck or something else? Mecha battle damage, 23%. The military staff officer in the command center stared dumbfoundedly at the image on the screen. He pulled up the data and confirmed that the black mecha had still survived the second round of Iron 7 Division's normal shooting. What was even more frightening was that, after this extremely dramatic visual impact of the components peeling off and sputtering, the black mecha, which was already moving at an extremely fast speed, seemed to have instantly increased its speed by several notches. The steep peak of Mount Blue Cake, which was over 1,000 meters long, was actually about to touch the bottom. "Enter overclocking mode," he shouted loudly. There were many people in the command center who had watched Ka Chifeng's battle before. When they saw the black mecha's components being detached, they had already guessed that the black mecha was preparing to enter overclocking mode. What shocked them was the way the black mecha had entered overclocking mode. General Miles narrowed his eyes at the screen. Forcefully entering an overclocking state at such a high speed, yet the high-speed sputtering of components did not cause any problems with the balance of the MX mecha itself. Could it be that Shula's level of mecha control had already reached this level? When the black mecha appeared on the mountain peak, Du Shaoqing's expression was only occasionally gloomy, but it was immediately back to normal. When the black mecha rushed down towards the camp in a valiant manner, he was still sitting on the sofa, his expression as cold as ever, his sunglasses still by his side, unmoving. But when he saw the black mecha enter overclocking mode in such a manner, his fingers on the sofa's armrest finally moved. The major beside him glanced at him, but in the end did not hand over the sunglasses. After the shock of the command center, there was silence. Everyone looked at the screen in confusion. Even if it had entered overclocking mode, the black mecha was about to turn into a stream of light and smash into the ground. What was that pilot going to do? On the peak of Ka Chifeng, the purple CMX controlled by Madman Li could not even last 3 minutes of overclocking mode. The Nutshell Standard MX, which used Little White Flower as its prototype, did not have that kind of fatal flaw. However, overclocking was still an overload on the mecha system. Be it the designer or the user, no one would expect to be able to maintain such a crazy and dangerous state forever. Shula was both the designer and the user. Naturally, he knew this better than anyone else. In an instant, the falling black mecha was forcefully pulled back up from the ground. No one could defy the laws of nature, so when the people in the command hall saw the black mecha crash into the ground like a blind tiger, they all thought that the black mecha would not survive. In order to pass through the layers of defensive firepower of the Iron 7th Division, the black mecha had no choice but to engage in a high-speed charge. However, in the end, it seemed that the black mecha would also be destroyed by the high-speed charge. The generals and officers did not close their eyes because they could not bear to watch. They only frowned, very worried about the safety of the pilot. Just a few flashes of lightning and thunder from before had already made them feel a strong sense of respect for the pilot. There were only about 3 people in the hall who still had confidence in the black mecha. General Miles and Minister Zhu looked at the screen calmly. Their confidence came from the attitude of the old man in Philadelphia and Shula's previous performance. However, the third person was a little strange, because it was Du Shaoqing. Du Shaoqing looked coldly at the screen. He definitely did not believe that the black mecha would be stupid enough to commit suicide. Just as he expected, in the next moment, the entire command hall suddenly fell into a collective silence. Everyone looked at the black mecha on the screen, shocked, speechless, as if it had turned into a fossil. At this moment, the image on the screen seemed to have been muted. The scene in the valley camp also seemed to have been muted. There was only a deathly silence. The dense cluster of flaming grenade cannons tried to lift their barrels in vain. The anti-infantry mines that were still exploding seemed to have disappeared as well. Only small mushrooms rose from the steep slope and then dissipated into a sandstorm cloud. In the dead silence, the soldiers of Iron 7 Division, who were as calm as machine parts, finally couldn't help but reveal shocked expressions. Like the spectating officers in the command hall, they raised their heads and looked at the silent picture without any reaction. In the greenish-yellow sandstorm cloud, the silvery-white streamlined wings attached to the waist of the black mecha that was charging down at high speed had already spread out. The black mecha had already left the ground, whistling through the sand and the rain of bullets, and was sprinting towards the camp. At this moment, it really flew. Mecha could not fly, and neither could the MX. However, at high speeds, with the help of its perfectly designed wings, it could glide through the air. This was originally designed to be used to forcibly drop mecha into the air, but today, the black mecha that Shula was piloting had shown another use for it. In Ka Chifeng's shocking battle, because of the vacuum of the Old Moon polar region, the wings attached to the two MX mechas had only played a part of the role of balance. Today's charge, if not for the terrain to forcibly increase the mecha's speed to the maximum, how could it have been able to glide through the air in such a beautiful curve? The unexpected had to be obtained from the unexpected. Countless people watched as the black mecha soared into the air like a giant blackbird, passing through the control fire of the local defense camp. They could not help but be shocked speechless. This scene would be branded in everyone's minds for a long time. In reality, the black mecha had only stayed in the air for 2 seconds, but it had already forcibly passed through the most concentrated line of fire of the local defense camp to land in the middle of the camp. With a loud boom, the black mecha's alloy mechanical feet landed heavily on the ground. Shards of metal and dirt flew everywhere, and the Iron 7 Division soldiers who were yelling at the top of their lungs fell down in all directions. But what no one expected was that after the black mecha had passed through the control fire of the local defense camp, it did not directly enter the location of the command center. Instead, before landing, it forcibly twisted its body 30 degrees to the west, aiming for an ordinary barracks at the entrance of Blue Cake Mountain. At this moment, the deathly still scene seemed to have a sound once again. The sound of guns, electronic screams, and the sound of the self-propelled artillery system's motors rang out densely. But the MX mecha had already passed through the middle of the camp. How could these control fire of the local defense camp keep up with its ghostly footsteps? Under normal conditions, the Black MX was already able to avoid long-range attacks. Now that it was in overclocking mode, its trembling body, strange twisting movements, and dazzling fast dodging movements allowed the Black MX to successfully avoid most of the interception and rush towards its target. In the cockpit, Shula's face was pale. Cold sweat flowed down his face. The heat in his body was quickly draining away. After controlling the MX to perform so many perverted movements, his energy and physical strength had already reached the limit. Most importantly, the damned hunger in his stomach had come to disturb him again. Without hesitation, he controlled the MX to charge towards that ordinary barracks at the fastest speed possible. This was because he knew that Shimon Jin was in that ordinary barracks. The room on the right that seemed to be the command center was, in fact, empty. Shimon Jin was indeed very careful. Even though the Iron 7th Division had clearly obtained an overwhelming victory, he still made so many strict arrangements in the camp headquarters. That alone was not enough. He had even disguised the command center. This kind of commander was really scary. So when the onboard radar alarm sounded and 4M52 mecha suddenly appeared in front of the ordinary barracks, Shula was not at all surprised. Shimon Jin had only used 2/3 of his military strength to forcefully suppress the officers and cadets in the lonely Yellow Mountain Ridge area. The rest of his forces were all placed in the command center. Moreover, these 4M52 mecha that had been hidden for a long time had been warmed up since the start of the drill, silently guarding this area. This was not a trap set up by Iron 7th Division. This was the meticulous design and strict tactical discipline of the Iron 7th Division that they had learned from Du Shaoqing. A dignified division would not fight an unprepared war. They had to be prepared to the fullest. This way, once the situation changed, any backup plan of the Iron 7th Division could become a trap that could kill the enemy. But so what if it was a trap? Facing the 4M52 mecha that had their camouflage cloth removed, the heavy mechanical legs of the Black MX quickly moved on the ground, turning into a series of afterimages. It avoided the hail of bullets at an unimaginable speed and closed in on the bodies of the 2M52 mecha. The Black MX's right alloy fist smashed heavily into the central system of one of the M52 mecha, easily breaking through the sturdy alloy armor. At the same time, its left alloy hand reached out like lightning to fiercely control the right arm of the other M52 that was spraying bullets. The huge difference in power output made the M52 mecha that the military had always been proud of look like a drunkard in front of the Black MX. Moreover, it was completely unable to break free from the Black MX's control. The Carlin barrels of the 2M52 mecha were still rotating at high speed, spraying bullets. However, they were unable to hit the Black MX between them. Instead, they aimed at each other's chests and abdomens. Two beautiful streaks of bullet fire splashed into the mecha like electric sparks, instantly destroying each other. Meanwhile, the Black MX controlled by Shula pushed up with both arms, shaking off the 2M52 mecha that had already stopped moving, and with a whoosh, it dove in. It had to be admitted that Shula's breakout had ultimately taken advantage of many military exercises. If both sides had used live ammunition, in that shocking scene earlier, the 2M52 mecha would have been forced to shoot at each other. At such a close distance, the high-speed spray of armor-piercing bullets would definitely have hurt the Black MX mecha. The Federation's military exercise combat system was extremely accurate. Once the central control computer confirmed that a mecha had been killed, it would immediately stop working, including the soldiers. After the Black MX had swiftly and valiantly killed the 2M5 mecha, it then charged towards the normal barracks. At this moment, the Black mecha was like a special forces soldier engaging in close combat, fiercely throwing 14 punches at the remaining 2M5 mecha. Based on Shula's understanding of mecha structures, these heavy blows were definitely enough to ensure that these two mecha would never have the chance to stand up again. Suddenly, the Black mecha's right mechanical arm reached out, and as quick as lightning, it grabbed one of the already stopped M52 mecha and threw it viciously to the right. The Black MX mecha was about the same weight as the M-series mecha, but after stripping off the components and entering an overclocked state, its body appeared much slimmer in comparison. However, with its powerful twin engines outputting 4 times the power output, it was actually able to easily grab the M52 mecha and throw it. This scene was very strange. It was as if a delicate woman with a frosty expression had picked up a burly man and thrown him away like a sandbag. Of course, the Black mecha had not done this to vent, but to humiliate the Iron 7th Division. The M52 mecha it had thrown accurately hit a self-propelled heavy cannon 50 meters to the right. That modified self-propelled heavy cannon did not even have time to blast out the electromagnetic beam bomb that mecha feared the most before it was smashed all over the ground by this ruined mecha that had been thrown over. The graphite beams that shot out were extremely magnetic as they stuck to the ruined mecha and began to flash with blue electric arcs. This pitiful mecha that had been used as a sandbag twitched uncontrollably. The Black mecha shuddered as it moved at high speed, clearing out all the targets in its path one by one. It twisted its body forcefully in mid-air, using an extremely beautiful pose to transform into a phantom, nimbly dodging the 4 incoming rocket projectiles by a hair's breadth. Speed. What it needed was speed. The Black mecha pushed its speed to the limit. Whether it was the 4 hidden mechas, the electromagnetic beam bomb, or the individual rocket projectiles that were impossible to defend against, none of them could stop the Black mecha's footsteps for even a moment. Before the remaining armored soldiers of the Iron 7th Division could surround it, the Black mecha had already inconceivably crossed 70 meters in a second. With one foot, it overturned an electronically linked armored vehicle. With a shake of its body, it rushed to the front of the ordinary barrack and smashed open the door with a punch. In the barrack, the officers and staff of the Iron 7th Division looked at the Black mecha outside the door, their expressions extremely ugly. The Black mecha was like a skilled assassin that could kill with a single strike. It didn't give them much time to react. Shimon Jin, whose hair was a little dry, turned around and glanced at the Black mecha. She was about to say something. However, the pilot in the Black mecha did not have the demeanor of an assassin. Before Shimin Jin could speak, the pilot in the black mecha lifted its heavy mechanical arm and completed the last designated action through the control system. Under the burning gazes of the officers of the Iron 7th Division, the black mecha's right alloy arm pointed directly at the highest commander here, Shimin Jin. Chapter 341. The Black MX mecha had already stripped away all of its long-range firepower systems. Right now, facing the gloomy Iron 7th Division officers from outside the barracks, if it wanted to complete its tactical objective, it could only rely on the mecha's movements. In other words, Shimin Jin could only be trampled to death, beaten to death, and tortured to death by the black mecha. Shula didn't want to humiliate the opponent, but this was the only way he could fight. Of course, he couldn't really break through the door and use his heavy mechanical legs to trample Shimin Jin into minced meat. He could only enter the next step into the battle damage system in the Military Exercise Command Center. Through precise calculations, the command center directly determined that his actions were effective. In the next moment, the Military Exercise Command Center and the officers and soldiers of the Iron 7th Division all received a notification from the battle damage system. The blue team commander has died. The officers and generals in the command center couldn't hide their shock as they watched the image on the screen. The black mech rushed down from the top of Blue Pond Peak. The smoke and cannons exploded. In just a few moments, this MX had already successfully broken through the barracks, completing this mission that seemed impossible to complete in the first place. General Miles's white eyebrows bloomed as he sighed softly in relief. The Minister of Defense, Zhu Yingxing, calmly picked up the cup of tea beside him and took a sip. The tea was already cold, but he didn't react at all. It seemed that this military big shot was hiding a lot of emotions under his calm exterior. Then, everyone's eyes turned to the right side of the command center. The Federal Army officers were very curious. What kind of expression would the usually cold and arrogant division commander Du Shaoqing have after witnessing the defeat of his own troops? To their surprise and slight disappointment, although Division Commander Du Shaoqing had already stood up, his expression was still cold, his posture dignified, and his figure straight. He didn't seem to have suffered such a heavy blow at all. Of course, some people still noticed that Division Commander Du's hands were clenched tightly behind his back. His knuckles were faintly white. The soldiers in the military drill hall were shocked by the performance of the black mecha, marveling at the unimaginable level of control displayed by the pilot. Du Shaoqing was the same. Other than anger and gloom in his heart, he also felt a strong sense of incomprehension. As an all-rounder in military affairs, Division Commander Du Shaoqing's mecha piloting skills were also quite outstanding. However, after seeing Shula operate the Black MX with his own eyes, he could not use a logical deduction to convince himself that this was something a normal person could do. Du Shaoqing's face was cold and detached as he looked at the black mecha and his subordinates on the screen. His brows furrowed, those straight eyebrows that had always been like unsheathed swords seemed to have been resheathed at this moment. They became silent, as if they were waiting for something to happen. A moment later, another exclamation rang out in the Military Exercise Command Hall. The military staff officer who had completely lost his cool today stood up from behind the workbench and loudly reported, "Mecha damage 61%, 88%. 100%, the Black MX has exploded." The Military Exercise Command Hall suddenly fell into a state of busy calculations and shocked discussions. The staff officers could not understand why the Black MX had suddenly exploded after successfully breaking through the camp. The armored squad of the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion had not yet arrived. What exactly happened in the command center? General Miles, who was sitting on the sofa, was stunned. He frowned and immediately thought of the part of the battle force that the Iron 7th Division had not used during this impromptu military exercise. After a moment of silence, a look of appreciation appeared on his face. Du Shaoqing looked at the screen expressionlessly. That pair of eyebrows of his raised again. Although it was not as insufferably arrogant and unstoppable as before, it had recovered some of its luster. From the beginning of the military exercise until now, the defense battalion under the command of Shimin Jin had not used that fixed-speed non-cruise missile unit. He believed that his soldiers would not disappoint him to the extreme. The unforeseen event happened too quickly. The command system had just reported the news of the blue team's commander's death when a sharp alarm rang out from the central control system of the mecha. Looking at the red energy lines blotting out the sky and covering the Earth on the full-view radar screen, Shula could not help but sweat profusely, drenching his back in the stuffy cockpit, even though he knew that this was all virtual. Different from the level-fire howitzers from before, a dense cluster of missiles flew in from an unknown base and covered the entire area around the barracks. It did not distinguish between friend and foe and carried out a powerful attack. The power of the missiles was set to explode, and on the virtual screen, the entire barracks turned into a sea of fire. Almost at the same time as the command hall, the battle damage system connected to the black mecha coldly and mechanically reported the battle damage situation. In just the blink of an eye, the black MX, which had not yet lost 30% of its battle force, had its red column representing the status of the mecha drop continuously as if it was rapidly losing blood. In the end, the system determined that the mecha had exploded. During this process, the black mecha had no time to react at all. Faced with the high-speed missiles that blotted out the sky and covered the Earth, even if it could react, it would not be able to complete any evasive maneuvers. It could only watch as its body was buried in the sea of fire. A deathly silence. Shula narrowed his eyes as he stared intently at the data feedback on the screen. Listening to the cold voice of the system, he pondered in silence for a long time before he finally understood the source of all this. A fixed-velocity non-cruise missile unit. The military exercise command system had added a group of virtual soldiers for both sides of the exercise, and what had been added to the Iron 7th Division's Defense Battalion was this two-base missile unit. During the exercise that had started before dawn, the Iron 7th Division had not used this unit at all. They had actually been suppressing it all this time until the very end, when they finally aimed at their own command center and launched a barrage of attacks without distinguishing friend from foe. This virtual unit was equipped with the Stinger II missile, which had terrifying absolute speed. However, it also had an extremely fatal flaw. The direct injection vortex engine made it impossible for this type of fast missile to perform precise navigation. Therefore, using this type of light missile to attack the powerful MX mecha from a distance would be very difficult to achieve any results. However, Shimin Jin had placed the missile base in the valley behind Blue Pool Mountain, and aimed it at her own command center. This excellent and meticulous commander had maintained absolute self-control and calm throughout the entire exercise, saving this force for the very end. Even when Shula's black mecha had charged down from the mountain peak, due to the flaw of the Stinger II missile, the black mecha had still not been willing to fire recklessly. Only when the black mecha had penetrated deep into camp headquarters and was within the absolute range of the missile cluster did Shimin Jin launch a devastating attack. At such a close distance, with such a high density of continuous fire, the Stinger II missile did not need a cruise system at all to blast any enemy into pieces. If the black mecha had been in the valley at this time, it would probably have been able to rely on its mobility to dodge this wave of attacks. However, at this time, the black mecha had succeeded in its mission and was no longer vigilant. Most importantly, this wave of missiles had been coldly aimed at its location. How could it escape? Inside the glowing red cockpit, Shula pondered in silence for a very long time before he finally managed to sort out the sequence of events. Using the Stinger II missile against a mecha, only Shimin Jin's method could achieve tactical results. However, what made him feel even colder was that the Iron 7th Division had actually buried the entire command center with it, wanting to bury him here. This kind of design was a little too cruel. He rubbed his stiff face, shook his head, and pressed the button to open the cockpit. Accompanied by the sound of hydraulic systems and motors, the cockpit of the black mecha at the entrance to the command center of the Iron 7th Division's defense camp slowly opened. At this time, the military exercise command system had already determined that all personnel near the command center were dead, so the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division could only stare at the open cockpit door with ugly expressions. They did not raise their weapons to aim at the enemy. Although this black mecha had exploded and died in the end, the other party had broken into their camp and killed 4 of their own mecha in an instant. In the end, they had even killed their highest commanding officer. This was the equivalent of a tight slap to their faces. The pale-faced Shula crawled out of the cockpit, but he did not climb down to the ground. Instead, he stood on the alloy railings and looked down at the angry Iron 7th Division officers with narrowed eyes. Although he had been determined to be dead in the end, he had done everything he could. He had successfully broken into camp and killed the enemy's commander, so there was a hint of youthful excitement in his calm mood. There was no regret or sadness. "You're really ruthless." Shula felt unusually tired. He wiped the sweat off his forehead with his fingers and sat down on the slightly hot mecha. Leaning against the tough alloy armor, he looked down at the gloomy commander in the barracks and said seriously, "I admit that Iron 7th Division has the right to be proud." These were sincere words. In today's impromptu military exercise, Ju-Yu's group of officers who were born in the Lonely Mountain and Yellow Mountain Ridge area had displayed their strongest abilities. Otherwise, they would not have been able to delay the large number of soldiers of the defense camp for so long and give Shula a chance to break into camp. However, in the face of Iron 7th Division's well-trained and unusually calm offensive, the Red Team could only lose. What was even more frightening was that Shula had cheated and had the ability to operate a mecha that few people in this world understood. He had displayed the performance of the Black MX to the extreme and unexpectedly broke into the camp. In the end, he had encountered 3 layers of backup from Iron 7th Division. Although he had succeeded in killing the enemy's commander in the end, he had also ushered in death. Shimon Jin sat in the barracks with a calm expression. He did not pick up the coffee cup in his hand again. His mood was not as calm as his expression. He had long been boiling with anger. He had commanded the most powerful defense camp of Iron 7th Division, but he had actually been broken in by a single Black MX. The commander had been killed. What kind of humiliation was this? He did not raise his head to speak to Shula on the Black Mecha because that would make people feel that Shula was looking down at him with the attitude of a victor. Chapter 342. The battle at the front line of Lonely Ridge had just ended a minute ago. The military exercise command system had used the fastest speed to determine the outcome. Although the Red Team had successfully killed the Blue Team's commander, the Red Team's final members had all been killed. The Blue Team had completed the final tactical mission, so the system determined the Blue Team's victory. Hearing the notification of victory, Shimon Jin's expression became more and more unsightly. How could this kind of victory taste good? I never thought of using the sharp stinger Type 2. In the valley, I was just being cautious out of habit. However, I really didn't think that your side would actually have a mecha that could break into my command center. Just when the camp command center was deathly silent, Shimon Jin suddenly opened her mouth and said, "But there is one thing that I don't understand no matter how I think about it. To pass through my electronic detection, your mecha must have entered the automatic electronic shield, then how were you able to find my camp?" This commander finally raised his head and looked at the exhausted Shula sitting on the mecha. He asked, "Not only did you find the camp, you even guessed that this room was the real command center. How did you do it?" Shimon Jin used a philosophical tone, frowning as he supported himself on the table and asked the question that had puzzled him for a long time. The humiliation of being successfully broken into by the opponent had magnified the questions and shock in his heart by countless times. Thus, he would rather raise his head and look at the high and mighty Shula and ask aloud. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division around the Blue Pool Valley gradually gathered. There were about 150 of them, and all of them had already been determined to be dead by the command system. The soldiers looked at the black mecha disguised as the entrance of the command center. They looked at the young pilot leaning against the body of the mecha. Their faces were ashen, and the hostility in their gazes was almost enough to cause some kind of substantial harm. Shula was Dong Lin's stone. He would never be affected by the emotions of his enemies. He would not be moved by external things. His face was like a hard stone covering the outside of a stone, blocking out all these gazes. After a moment of silence, he looked at Shimon Jin below the mecha and said, "Yesterday, when Instructor Du was lecturing the officer students, He said that soldiers should have a gambling spirit. I just took a gamble. Looks like my luck is not bad and I won the gamble. Shimon Jin looked at him with gloomy expression and said, "Who will believe these words?" Shula was speechless. He thought to himself that he couldn't possibly dance around on the mecha and then sing in a hoarse voice, "This is a little secret, I won't tell you, I'll tell you." Looking at Du Shaoqing's cold style, Shimon Jin, who was sitting firmly in the camp and was still trying her best to imitate Du Shaoqing's cold style even though she had died miserably, Shula looked at the string of pale yellow radiance on the head of this outstanding commander and wanted to tell the other party, "Not only do I know where your headquarters is, I even know that you are a citizen of Donglin, and you are 35 years old this year." However, looking at Shimon Jin's bloodshot eyes and dry and unnatural hair, Shula didn't say anything in the end as he thought of the other party's current mood. He maintained his composure under the hateful gazes of the Iron 7th Division soldiers surrounding him and didn't appear to be too happy. At noon, the troops participating in the military exercise finally retreated one by one. Although it was only a small impromptu military exercise, a battle on the scale of 1,000 people, transporting the damaged equipment back was already quite troublesome. What was even more troublesome was that the soldiers who had been injured by the flying debris during the Black Mecha's breakout needed to be treated in time. Fortunately, there were no real fatalities. Even so, although the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division who had retreated were as silent and calm as usual, anyone could find a different emotion in their eyes: unwillingness and intense anger. This anger was not directed at the Red Team officer students in the exercise, but rather at this unexpected outcome, this embarrassing victory. What kind of army was the Iron 7th Division? The brotherly troops who had suffered a dismal ending in 37 military exercises knew best. They were as solemn as winter to the enemy, and as harsh as the harshest of art connoisseurs who refused to accept red packets from cultural foundations. They were extremely strict in their management, and on the battlefield, they cruelly demanded that there be no loopholes. The problem was that in this impromptu military exercise, they didn't think that they had done anything wrong, but they still lost, so they were angry. At the same time, they also had countless complex emotions towards the pilot who had piloted the Black Mecha. There was hatred, confusion, shock, and all kinds of emotions mixed together, but they still returned to the original point: anger. On the military airport, heavy transport aircraft were taking off and landing non-stop. Heavy transport helicopters whizzed past like large birds. Further away, transport spaceships were on standby. Soldiers with orderly footsteps walked across the road with stern expressions. The entire base was filled with a busy and solemn atmosphere. Shimon Jin, whose dry black hair was messy in the wind, led the staff officers of the defense battalion and walked at the front of the line. Her expression was very ugly, and even when she walked into the warehouse of the base, the expression on her face didn't change at all. Unlike the anger of the Iron 7th Division, the military officers who were in line couldn't hide the smile on their faces. All of them who had represented the Red Team had died or been captured, and they had just been released by the main force of the Iron 7th Division. Everyone should have been dejected, with a face full of grief and indignation, doing their duty as a loser, but they just smiled and looked outside the warehouse. In this military exercise, the performance of the military officers was actually very outstanding. Relying on the 7MXs and the virtual forces transferred by the central computer, they actually managed to hold the main force of the defense battalion of the Iron 7th Division at the front line of the lonely Yellow Mountain Ridge for more than an hour. This bought precious time and opportunity for Shula to break through the camp. But after being scolded like a snowstorm by Du Shaoqing yesterday afternoon, they couldn't be proud of this kind of thing. The reason for their pride was the black MX that was slowly being lowered by the heavy helicopter outside the warehouse. Shula, wearing a black high-energy material pilot suit, rubbed his sweaty hair, dragged the heavy black workbench box, and walked at the back of the line into the warehouse where the participating soldiers were lined up. The moment he appeared in front of everyone, Juyu, who had a gentle smile on his face, and Hua Xiaoxi, whose left shoulder was injured, were the first to start clapping. Although close to 1,000 Iron 7 Division officers and men were looking ahead without any movement, the 30-odd trainees, 17 men from Team 7, and the staff officers in the base were applauding fervently. It was as if there was a thunderstorm, as if there was a clap of thunder in spring. Shula was slightly taken aback, but then he narrowed his eyes and smiled. He raised his hand and waved in the direction of the trainees. Then he heard the sharp whistles and cheers of the 7th Division. Hearing the applause, whistles, and cheers, the expressions of the Iron 7th Division soldiers, who had been cold and calm, became even more gloomy. Listening to the applause, Shula thought back to the day when the MX Mecha had been successfully developed in the underground storeroom of the Nutshell Engineering Department in the Harbor City Industrial Park. When he and Shong Qiu had walked into the quiet storeroom, what had greeted them had also been such a moving applause. Suddenly, he had the urge to call Shong Qiu and tell her about this scene. The biggest difference between glory and vanity was whether or not you had done the right thing for this sense of glory. If the glory Shula enjoyed after the military exercise was vanity, he wouldn't reject it. He would only enjoy it, and he would be willing to enjoy it monotonously and repeatedly. Minister Zhu and General Mias didn't participate in the inspection after the military exercise. The two most powerful big shots in the military had to leave some face for the Iron 7th Division. After all, the final victor of the military exercise was the Iron 7th Division. If they were there, they would have to be kind to Shula and protect him. Where would the dignity of the Iron 7th Division go? In addition, these two big shots probably also thought that Shula was already in a pot of oil right now, so there was no need to give him too much face and splash a ladle of alcohol on him. What ended the thunderous applause in the warehouse was another round of monotonous and dull applause. The commander of the Iron 7th Division, Du Shaoqing, had a calm expression on his face. He looked at Shula, who walked in with a box, and clapped lightly with his hands that were wearing lambskin gloves. The applause was somewhat dull, so the applause in the warehouse quietened down. Complete silence. Shula walked to the front of the formation and gave a military salute. The reception after the military exercise ended very quickly. The federal military needed this exercise to change the inherent tactical thinking of many of the generals. But in reality, if one carefully analyzed these two exercises, the Iron 7th Division led by Du Shaoqing was actually the unit that didn't need to be hammered the least. The nimble and precise tactical design allowed the Iron 7th Division to seamlessly coordinate with the MX Mecha's powerful attacks. The soldiers in the warehouse gradually dispersed. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division gathered together, and the officers and men of the Iron 7th Division naturally gathered together. Lan Xiaolong glanced at Shimin Jin, who walked past him, and said, "I'm really sorry, we lost again. But please believe me, we didn't go easy on you." In order to cover for Shula's black MX Mecha going deep into the mountains, the Iron 7th Division had no choice but to expose themselves. All of them were surrounded. Lan Xiaolong was pitifully captured, but in front of the Iron 7th Division, he didn't feel like a captive at all. Nearly 1,000 Iron 7th Division soldiers heard these provocative words, and their expressions turned ugly. But in the end, they couldn't stage a gang fight in front of so many high-ranking military officials in the warehouse. Even Shimin Jin only paused for a moment before leaving the scene. Ju Yu patted Lan Xiaolong's shoulder and indicated for him to look outside the warehouse. In reality, most of the soldiers on the field had already cast their gazes outside. The sun above the mountains was gradually moving westward, and dusk was gradually thickening. In the light red background, on a protruding hill, two figures stood facing each other. It was like a scene out of a paper cut. Du Shaoqing and Shula. Chapter 343. Your comrades are all dead. Du Shaoqing looked calmly at the red clouds on the narrow flatland between the mountains in the distance. His gloved hands were behind his back as he asked, "If you were facing an entire mechanical regiment, would you be able to charge into the regiment headquarters?" This Federation's youngest Major General did not deliberately take off his gloves in front of Shula because of yesterday's conflict. His heart, which had been honed for many years in the military, could no longer be affected by such small matters. Shula was silent for a long time before he said, "I can't do it now, but that doesn't mean I can't do it in the future." He understood the meaning of this conversation between Du Shaoqing and himself, so he decided not to give in at all. Du Shaoqing looked at him coldly and said, "Even if you can, no one else can." This was a judgment that directly hit the nail on the head regarding this military exercise. If not for the help of the glory of the Charter, if not for the tyrannical methods that the uncle had taught him, how could Shula have done all this? He could do it, but the other ace pilots of the Federation military could not do it. This was a feat that could not be repeated, so it could not become a template for the Federation military. "You're not a qualified commander." Du Shaoqing looked at him coldly and said coldly, "And you'll never be able to become a qualified commander in the future." Shula silently agreed with this judgment, but when he felt the coldness and faint contempt in this person's words and thought of the killing intent he had felt yesterday, his heart suddenly hardened. He raised his head and said, "Commander, that qualified commander of yours has just been killed by me." Du Shaoqing was not as angry as he had been yesterday. He had already sunk all his disgust toward this young man into his bones. He looked at Shula and said, "The Federation has a modern military system. If a commander dies, there's still a replacement. This is also why the Military Exercise Command Hall still judged the blue team to be the winner even though you successfully broke through the camp and killed Shimin Jin. The Federation has a modern military system, but the Empire doesn't." Shula looked at him and said, "Marshal Li killed the Emperor of the Empire, and the Empire was forced to retreat. The President of the Federation is dead, but there's still the Vice President and the Deputy Speaker, but they can't. We're training our soldiers to fight the Empire, not the Iron 7th Division." This was almost a quibble, but it was impossible to find a problem with it. Du Shaoqing's thick eyebrows, which were like heavy swords, trembled. He was silent, but the fists behind his back were clenched. Shula stood quietly by his side, looking at the man's firm and resolute face under the twilight. He thought to himself, given the man's lofty status and fanatical support in the Iron 7 Division, if he really died, the Iron 7 Division would be destroyed as well. Du Shaoqing seemed to have guessed what Shula was thinking. He looked into the distance and said indifferently, "If I personally commanded the military exercise troops, do you think your MX would be able to kill me?" This sentence was very calm, but it was mixed with endless confidence and strong deterrence, making it difficult for anyone to doubt it, including Shula. He pursed his dry lips and repeated what he said before, "You can't do it now, but it doesn't mean you can't do it in the future. You're not a marshal. You defeated Madman Li once and destroyed the Imperial Guard Battalion once, but it doesn't mean you can go anywhere in the universe." Du Shaoqing looked at him indifferently, not hiding the disgust in his heart. After 2 days of military exercise, Shula had gradually caught on to the complex reasons why Commander Du disliked him. This condescending and oppressive hostility came from Park Ji-ho, from the 2 officers he killed, from the old man in Philadelphia, but more than that, it came from the philosophy and the unpredictable future of the army. In fact, from a certain point of view, even Shula admitted that Commander Du Shaoqing and his 7th Division were walking the right path of military management. Shula was just following the old path of the Li brothers, walking on an old path that could not be replicated or promoted. It was not the normal path, but he did have the ability to not walk the normal path. Uncle Feng Yu once praised Shula's ability to see through people's minds. This ability was even better than his mechanical engineering talent. The reason why he had this ability was probably because Shula could maintain an absolutely calm and clean heart under high-speed thinking, so his gaze was extremely penetrating. After being together for several years, he could still feel the indifference in the depths of the uncle's heart. If they had only met for the first time in life, he had already grasped a certain wave band that was deeply hidden in Shi Qinghai's source of darkness. The acquaintance was cold and the friendship was absurd. However, he had calmly accompanied Zuyu on a crucial journey. The reason why he had become close friends with the 3 of them was that he could see through their truest thoughts. If there was a mistake in judgment, it was probably only by Yulon. With this kind of insight, Shula could see through Du Shaoqing's heart. It was not a difficult thing. "Commander, you want to be the 2nd Li Pifu, the 2nd Federation's god of war." Shula narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at the dusk on the horizon. He said, "But I don't. I know that I'm just a piece of material that can withstand training, but it's difficult to assemble into the big machine that is the army, and I don't have the ability to drive the group forward. So, I don't want to be the second Li Pifu, I just want to be the only Shu Le. Du Shaoqing was silent for a moment. After laughing out of anger yesterday, he returned to his cold expression. Listening to Shu Le's words, no one knew if he would be moved, but at least on the surface, he was still a cold and iron-blooded commander. When I was studying in No. 1 Academy, Li Jiedu was an instructor in our department. He is now the Vice Dean of No. 1 Academy. Du Shaoqing said in a deep voice, "Someone from the constellation has appeared. I hope you won't disappoint me. See you in the West Woods." After saying this, the representative of the young generation of the federal military walked down the hill in an extremely straightforward manner, leaving Shu Le with only a rather awe-inspiring back view. Li Jiedu was the son of the old man in Philadelphia and Madman Li's father. Why did Du Shaoqing suddenly say this? Was it just because he was lamenting that there was suddenly an anomaly like Shu Le in the army? Watching Du Shaoqing walk down the hill, surrounded by the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division, Shu Le's heart was filled with complex emotions. What made him extremely vigilant was that the tone of Du Shaoqing's last conversation with him was so calm. The coldness and murderous intent from the day before had been completely wiped out. There was a type of person in this world who was born with a certain temperament. Those who held grudges and protected those who were close to them would be seen as quick to repay kindness and revenge. Those who were cold and bloodthirsty would be seen as iron-blooded. Even if he was standing in a pile of black ores, he would still be as dazzling as a diamond. Even if he was in the midst of miasma and poisonous fog, he would still breathe like ice, giving people a sense of what it meant to be aloof from the world. In the bustling world, in the midst of millions of people, you would be able to see him as soon as you looked up. There was no doubt that Du Shaoqing was this type of person. He calmly left the warehouse, his military posture still perfect and precise. His well-ironed military uniform and his person were still calm, confident, and elegant, with a hint of bloody rust. Although the victory of the Iron 7th Division today was a little embarrassing, the soldiers who watched him leave still dared not look down on this division commander. If the two military exercises were personally commanded by this person, what would the result be? Shu Le narrowed his eyes and looked over there. His gaze moved from Du Shaoqing's back to Du Shaoqing's dry black hair behind him, then back to Du Shaoqing's upright body. His eyebrows gradually furrowed. Such a person had the intention to kill him, but he immediately wiped it clean. He was afraid that he would become even more dangerous. The next day, the base held a meeting with the high-ranking military officers. After the meeting, Du Shaoqing didn't even attend the meal. He directly took the spaceship to the old moon base, then transferred to the space battleship and embarked on the journey back to S3. The federal military had long been used to this division commander's behavior, so they wouldn't be so narrow-minded as to think that he was holding a grudge because the military exercises didn't go well. In the dark blue universe, a space battleship full of mechanical beauty was moving forward at a seemingly slow speed. In the luxurious cockpit, the guard officer, Shimin Jin, received a phone call and handed it to Du Shaoqing. Du Shaoqing was slightly startled. After taking the phone, he immediately stood up and said a few words in a deep voice. His attitude was abnormally serious and proper. There were only two people in the cockpit, Du Shaoqing and Shimin Jin. Naturally, no one saw this scene. Otherwise, they would definitely be surprised to see who was on the other side of the phone and who could make the usually cold and silent division commander Du stand up and stand at attention from tens of thousands of kilometers away. After putting down the phone, Du Shaoqing sat upright in the chair and slowly took off his sunglasses. His deep, statue-like eyes were filled with hidden anger and gloominess. His emotions had nothing to do with this phone call. In fact, from a long time ago, he had incomparably respected and trusted the other party. It was precisely because of the other party's sincere request that he had been forcefully suppressing his anger toward Shu Le in the base. Thinking of the young man with small eyes and the words the other party had whispered in his ear about flipping out, Du Shaoqing's expression became gloomy. He thought faintly in his heart, A professional soldier will never shoot his comrades in the back on the battlefield. However, if you violate military discipline in the future, Shu Le, don't blame me for being ruthless. Shimin Jin was silent to the side. His military cap was pressed extremely low, covering all of his hair. The sunglasses in Du Shaoqing's hand had already been crushed, revealing some extremely intricate pieces of circuit components. During the military exercises, he didn't conduct remote commands. This was his pride. However, his pride was being wantonly challenged by a small fry. It was really difficult for him to let go. Du Shaoqing silently told himself in his heart, "Your journey is the sea of stars." In an instant, his emotions calmed down. He slowly turned his head to look at the majestic view of outer space outside the window. He was silent for a long time. At the same time, Shu Le was sitting on the stone steps of the training ground of the base. He held a bottle of ale in his hand and looked up at the starry sky. He narrowed his eyes and looked at those ancient existences blinking their eyes. Suddenly, he thought of the words on the bracelet on his left hand and thought of some very complicated things. Iron 7 Division and Du Shaoqing were still undefeated, but he himself had shone brightly. Other than raising the status of the MX Mecha, did the federal military have some other deeper meaning in organizing these two exercises? Chapter 344. In the twilight, when he had a conversation with Du Shaoqing, there was not much sharpness or momentum, but Shu Le was a naive child. He did not think that this person's intention to kill him had really disappeared. On the contrary, he became more vigilant. A capable and powerful person was always watching his back. This kind of danger was no less than facing the rain of bullets at the Golden Foundation building. Regarding the victory of the military exercise, it seemed that he had cheated. Shu Le's big heart would not soften in front of the Iron 7 Division. He had already cheated, so it was very hypocritical of him to blame himself morally and emotionally side with the enemy. Moreover, in a sense, this was not cheating. It was just his unique secret ability that no one knew about. And for this ability, he had to run and wander in the Federation. He was in a coma and had no idea how many days he had lived in fear and anxiety. In the end, it was still the same sentence. If you only met for the first time in life and did not see each other again, then you would either miss the beauty, conflict, or hatred until death. The god of war Li Pifu and the iron-blooded division commander Du Shaoqing were both role models of professional soldiers. They belonged to the same school, but Shu Le and Uncle Feng Yu belonged to the opposite school. Although there were some crucial differences between Li Pifu and Du Shaoqing, and between Mechanic Feng Yu and Mechanic Shu Le, with Shu Le's experience and ability, he could not decipher it for the time being. It was probably like the enmity between Feng Yu and Li Pifu in Philadelphia. Because of the different schools of thought, Shu Le had an innate resistance to Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7 Division. People like Du Shaoqing and the soldiers of the Iron 7 Division, who were always cold and emotionless, should have been hated by the federal military. But strangely, the soldiers respected Du Shaoqing and the Iron 7 Division more than they hated them. Shu Le could not feel any respect or awe. As a fugitive from the Federation, he plunged headfirst into the great circle of fame and fortune in the capital ring. Like the tiny stars in the bracelet on his left hand, he was used to freely shining in the open space. So when he looked at Du Shaoqing and the Iron 7 Division, he felt uncomfortable and upset. After looking at the stars in the sky for a while, Shu Le used the malt wine bottle in his hand to support his tired body. He bent over and vomited in great discomfort. Coincidentally, he vomited into an empty space on the stone steps. This empty space was where Xiong Lingquan had opened the stone steps a few days ago when his godly power had erupted. It was not because he had drunk too much. Rather, it was because when the mecha had breached the camp, Shu Le had squeezed out all the burning energy in his body. His stomach had been empty to the extreme, and after he had overdosed on gastric acid, he had also eaten and drunk too much for the past day and night. So, his stomach had developed some problems. The black MX mecha had breached the camp in a seemingly simple, direct, and elegant manner, but only Schuler himself knew how much he had paid for it. Even with his abilities, his body had suffered great damage from using the simulation system to control such a heavy mecha. "Looks like my body is still not a machine after all," muttered Schuler to himself as he wiped his mouth and thought of the uncle's teachings back then. Schuler enjoyed the impromptu military drill battle to his heart's content. Because of the old man in Philadelphia, he no longer had to deliberately hide his tremor qigong. Even if some people suspected a certain most wanted criminal, who would dare to investigate if he pushed the blame to the Lee family? The military drill had brought many benefits to Schuler. Putting aside the rewards from the military for the time being, Mr. Sh's special pardon order was also out of the question for now. At least his days at the base had become much better. Trained officers were the proudest soldiers, and the 17 men of Team 7 were the hardest subordinates to train. However, after this battle, everything had changed. The strength Schuler had displayed in the military drill, and the most important thing was the condensation and sublimation of this collective sense of honor in the flames of war. This had made his position in the hearts of the students and the members of Team 7 rise qualitatively. Seeing this scene, the happiest person was not Schuler, but Lan Xiaolong and some of the higher-ups in the military. Secretary Bai was still recovering in the hospital. Although the stab was not fatal, it was not shallow. Without him here, all of the pressure was transferred to Major Lan Xiaolong. His mission was originally to mediate the relationship between Schuler and the members of Team 7. Although he did not know what the higher-ups of the Ministry of Defense were doing, he knew that Team 7 would definitely accept a very important mission in the future. And before this mission was carried out, Team 7 and the core of the military, Schuler, must become an unbreakable group. Looking at the military jeep in the distance, Lan Xiaolong had a trace of a smile on his face. Liu Jiao was dragging Schuler and Xiong Lingquan into the mountains to hunt rabbits to improve their meals. This blatant method of going against the HTD Bureau seemed to indicate that a small group was gradually forming. 3 days later, in the slightly bleak autumn wind, the training officers in the base forcibly changed their reluctance to leave into a kind of steely bear hug and salute. They bid farewell to Schuler and the members of Team 7, who were the last ones to stay behind, and boarded the military planes that returned to their respective units. Schuler looked at the aircraft leaving the runway, listened to the whistling sound, and smelled the faint burnt smell. His eyes habitually narrowed. His relationship with these officers had become extremely harmonious, but he had to say goodbye. The next time he saw them would probably be on the battlefield against the Empire, or in front of the Federation Heroes Cemetery. Thinking of this, even though he was young, he couldn't help but feel some indescribable emotions. The emotions quickly disappeared because Schuler and his Team 7 also received a vacation order from the Ministry of Defense. However, along with the rare vacation, there was also a secret order that they did not expect. Lan Xiaolong looked at the order that was signed by the relevant department of the Ministry of Defense and the president of Whitewater Company. His expression became ugly. After the Ministry of Defense requested Team 7 to undergo training, coupled with the rumors about Schuler, he had been mentally prepared to go to the front line. However, he did not expect Team 7 to accept this mission. "We were transferred from the army to go to the front line to kill the enemy. Why did we go back to Whitewater?" Xiong Lingquan frowned, but he was not worried. Instead, he was particularly fierce and angry. He said loudly, "We are soldiers, not the bodyguards of those stupid rich girls." The computer operator of Team 7 was called Jiyu Shifeng. He looked at the order and raised his eyebrows. He laughed and said, "I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Our Team 7 is originally from the Security Consulting Department. Although we have never done security work before, what's there to be afraid of?" Xiong Lingquan angrily glared at him. He wondered why Team 7 had such a piece of trash. Jiyu Shifeng said with great yearning, "Too bad this is a top-secret order. Otherwise, I really want to call my girlfriend. If she knew that I could work beside this young lady every day, wouldn't she be overjoyed?" Lan Xiaolong frowned. He thought that even if the target of protection was a national defense idol who was welcomed by the entire Federation, it did not make sense for the powerful Team 7 to be her bodyguards. Most importantly, the current supervisor of Team 7 was Shu Le. This young master had the most terrifying mountain in the Federation behind him. The military was clearly focused on training him, but now he was not allowed to go to the front line in the West Woods. Instead, he was assigned to guard the house. This was too unreasonable. Shu Le looked at the 3 words Jian Shueya on the order. While he was shocked, he could not help but feel endless doubts. He had not seen the name of this national idol girl for a long time. He also knew that Sister Tong had wanted him to be her bodyguard a long time ago. The question was, how could the military be so stupid as to turn him and Team 7, who were supposed to be the tip of the spear, into a group of bored people wearing sunglasses and playing with paper balls? If things were abnormal, there must be something wrong. Shu Le had never denied his feelings. Even though he had come into close contact with Jian Shueya under the sunlight of the 1st Military Region's General Hospital, that woman was still his dream lover. She was definitely his idol. This was the deepest imprint of adolescence. However, to be her bodyguard, there was something strange hidden in this abnormal arrangement. He couldn't help but think deeply about it. After all, he wasn't fighting alone now. There were more than 10 men following behind him. The vacation officially began. When the members of Team 7 walked out of the capital military airport in single file, Shu Le paused for a moment and suddenly said to Xiong Lingquan, "When will Bai Yulon's injury be healed?" On the outskirts of the capital, there was a building at the end of a dead-end road. In the entire Federation, this building had the strictest security level. It was even higher than the president's official residence and the management committee building. It was often called the Parliament Building because this was the Bureau of Proclamation. Whether it was raining or snowing, the outside of the Bureau of Proclamation building always seemed to be shrouded in a layer of faint light. This phenomenon covered the already mysterious Bureau of Proclamation with a layer of strange and gaudy clothing. It even attracted the fanatical worship of some scientific sects. Some curious civilian scientists wrote an analysis in a small weekly magazine. This was because the Federal Central Computer used too much power and too much data flow, which led to some weak ionization phenomena in the air around the Bureau of Proclamation. Therefore, it was very easy to produce astronomical phenomena such as rainbows. The staff of the Bureau of Proclamation naturally did not care about this. Their work schedule was actually not much different from that of ordinary government officials. It was only because they had to conform to the work program of the Central Computer deep underground that their work style appeared to be calmer and more peaceful. But today, the old voice in the Bureau of Proclamation Director's office was full of emotion and an unknown emotion. It had nothing to do with the words calm and peaceful. "I've always been pretending to be calm. Since more than 2 years ago, when the first alarm in this building sounded, I've been pretending." The old director of the Bureau of Proclamation stared at the file on the hologram expressionlessly. He stared at the young man squinting in the file and said, "When the alarm sounded, I went to play golf. I didn't participate in the joint conference. That was because I kept trying to convince myself that I didn't know how that traitor mechanic Yu Feng survived. But I'm not a fool, and I'm not a philosopher. I can't lie to myself." The old director's face was full of vicissitudes. Other than the Empire, the Central Computer has never sounded the first alarm. Fortunately, Yu Feng is dead. I'm very comforted. Chapter 345. The Bureau of Proclamation had never dealt with the small-eyed young officer, except during the presidential inauguration ceremony in the cold winter. The investigation team sent by the Bureau had cooperated with this person once, but it was not really a cooperation. It was just that both parties had the same goal for different reasons. But 2 people at the top of the Bureau of Proclamation were no stranger to Shu Le. Director Tai, in particular, liked this smiling young man very much, because this young man had helped the Bureau of Proclamation to survive a crisis. Before, the Bureau of Proclamation was in great danger because of the slow reaction time of the bureaucrats. He had held Medellin back and even eliminated Medellin in the end. However, the subsequent development of the situation, as well as the sentimental and vigilant feelings of the old director, were all related to this trace of liking. When the report of the Medellin case was being carried out in the presidential residence, the Bureau of Proclamation already had the intention of exonerating Xu Le and Shi Qinghai. When the military god of Philadelphia stepped out to protect Xu Le and President Parbre pardoned Xu Le, Director Tai naturally had the idea of recruiting this little guy into the Bureau of Proclamation. The 720,000-word first charter ensured that the Bureau of Proclamation would not participate in the specific management and politics of human society. Even the underground central computer had to remain neutral when it came to the anti-government army, let alone the internal affairs of the Federation government and the trial of the court. But since Xu Le had been pardoned, the Bureau of Proclamation naturally had no more obstacles to recruit Xu Le. Director Tai knew that the old man had stepped out to protect Xu Le because the federal military had great use for this person. No department in the Federation dared to fight with the military for a person. Even if there was, they probably would not dare to fight with the old man in Philadelphia. But the Bureau of Proclamation had this kind of status and confidence. So for the first time, Xu Le entered the Bureau of Proclamation's sights. After meeting with the old man from Philadelphia at Linyuan, Lady Tai deliberated for a long time. In the end, she did not tell the Bureau of Proclamation about Xu Le's secret. But once the Bureau of Proclamation began a comprehensive investigation of a certain person, even if it was based on a very positive idea, with the terrifying information-gathering ability of the central computer, it would still find countless problems. A shocking question: there were two people in the Federation. One was called Xu Le, and the other was also called Xu Le. One was a top-notch engineer who had developed the MX mech, the other was an orphan miner from Donglin, the other was an apprentice of the most wanted criminal in the Federation, the other was DLS 420500481X, and the other was SLAT 5102000431X. There seemed to be no relationship between these two people, except that they were both called Xu Le, and they looked very similar, like a pair of twin brothers. The Bureau of Proclamation was able to connect these two people who were separated by tens of thousands of kilometers because of the strict identity sorting process when recruiting core staff. But the most important thing was the information calculation ability of the cloud computing model of the Federal Central Computer Underground. "I'm not in the mood to play golf anymore." The old director's eyes were half closed, as if he did not want to look at Xu Le's picture on the holographic screen. His voice was a bit distant and indifferent. "If this little guy continues to wander outside." Kui Judong had been the assistant director of the Bureau of Proclamation for 7 years. For the last 3 years, he had been representing the Bureau of Proclamation to participate in the planning of confidential matters within the Federation. Everyone knew that after the old director retired, he would be the only candidate for the director of the Bureau of Proclamation that everyone in the Federation envied but avoided. Hearing the endless meaning in the director's words, a trace of helplessness flashed across Kui Judong's calm middle-aged face. He said, "There is no evidence." There were many core principles hidden in the first charter. Other than the absolute privacy protection of citizens, there was also a similar principle: the greater the power, the greater the ability, the more rules one had to follow. Therefore, the Bureau of Proclamation was without a doubt the most law-abiding place in the Federation. It was also the most law-abiding place. A long time ago, the Tai dynasty's royal palace was probably the same. Perhaps later on, those emperors gradually forgot the spirit of the first charter, which was why they drifted away in the long river of history. The Bureau of Proclamation now deeply suspected that the two Xu Le with different citizen ID numbers were the same person. This represented an extremely terrifying inference, but the problem was that they had no evidence. No, for Director Ying and Assistant Kui Judong in the office, this was not even a suspicion, but an irrefutable fact. This was because the Bureau of Proclamation had obtained the biological markers of the two Xu Le through some secret channel. The biological marker of Xu Le in Donglin was the file of medical welfare for the orphan miners before the Federation of Crystal Mines went bankrupt. The biological marker of Shu-Le in Shanglin was some of the remnant samples left behind when the General Hospital of the 2nd Military Region rescued Shu-Le after the terrorist attack on the S2 Foundation building. However, this kind of evidence obtained through non-legal procedures could not be considered evidence in the eyes of the law and the internal regulations of the Bureau of Proclamation. It could not even be presented. In fact, if the significance of this matter was not so frightening, Director Ying would not have used this method at all. In fact, even if evidence of the biological marker was found, it still needed to be provided to the central computer for judgment. Therefore, in short, the Bureau of Proclamation had already begun to suspect Shu-Le, but there was nothing they could do unless the central computer made a judgment and sent out an alarm. I think this matter should be reported to Vice President Byron, Qui Judong sincerely suggested to his superior with a heavy expression. According to the law of the Federation, the Vice President was also the chairman of the Administrative Committee of the Federation. He was a bridge between the President and the Parliament, and was also the only big shot in the political structure of the Federation who could deeply influence the Bureau of Proclamation. However, due to certain political habits, for countless years, the Vice President of the Federation rarely asked about the specific work of the Bureau of Proclamation. On the contrary, they would deliberately keep a distance. Everyone understood why. The old director was silent for a long time before he slowly shook his head and said, "If Shu-Le has really entered an abnormal state, then he will be the 72nd. According to the law of the first abnormal state, the only people who can access this information are President Parbray, me, and Marshal Li." He coughed twice before he looked at Qui Judong and said, "Actually, you shouldn't know about this, but I'm going to retire next year. These things have to be passed on to you, so there's no harm in hearing about it." Marshal Li, I never knew that the military could interfere with the operation of the Bureau of Proclamation. You have to know that even the president can't, Qui Judong said with surprise. Qui Judong said with some surprise. Of course, he respected the old man in Philadelphia very much, but he also knew how terrible the abnormal situation confirmed by the Federation Central Computer was. He always felt that something was wrong. When my predecessor passed this to me, he mentioned the abnormal state. The first abnormal state in the Federation was discovered by Marshal Li himself, and he reported it to the Bureau of Proclamation, old Director Tai said expressionlessly. "I already called Philadelphia 3 days ago." Qui Judong asked with anticipation, "What did the old man say on the phone?" The old director didn't answer but fell into a long silence. On that phone call, the response he got was, Shu-Le didn't enter an abnormal state, he was just affected by the previous abnormal state. Things weren't as serious as the Bureau of Proclamation thought. The glory of the charter that spread across the universe wasn't challenged again. The thing that the Bureau of Proclamation was most worried about had been eliminated forever with that person's death. The most important mission for the Bureau of Proclamation now was to dig out the seeds that the Empire had spread. The Bureau of Proclamation was an absolutely independent organization. Even with the personal guarantee of the Federation's God of War, the old director still couldn't relax because this was the most important danger that could break the glory of the Charter. His slightly squinted eyes showed the steadiness and persistence of the building. He broke the silence and said slowly, "Old man, you still haven't come to a conclusion?" Qui Judong shook his head and immediately began to rub his forehead. It seemed like he had a headache. The old director's face became really ugly. According to the spirit of the Charter, the Federal Central Computer would never stop a crime because logically and legally speaking, it would lead to a huge problem that was difficult to solve. Even if they investigated Senator Medellin and found out about the Empire's seed plan, the Central Computer would still automatically generate an investigation report and submit it to the Bureau of Proclamation for processing. Even at the beginning of the investigation, the Bureau of Proclamation would need to give the authority to the investigation. The only exception was the first sequence of events, and in the history of the past 1,000 years, the first sequence of events had only appeared a few times. The first time was the invasion of the Empire, and the other times were related to the traitorous pilot called Yu Feng. The staff of the Bureau of Proclamation were the authority examiners and the servers of the central computer. They began to suspect Xu Le, but the central computer never determined that this was an abnormal situation, and they had no way to submit a report to the government. The two people in the office had been waiting for the central computer's reaction. Just like 3 years ago, the old man underground had directly determined the first sequence of events and taken over the corresponding authority. Then, he would have transferred a warship from the Westwoods to kill the other party with one shot. It would not be like now where there was suspicion but no evidence, investigation but no results, and watching the other party with a strong hidden danger but unable to do anything. Why can't the old man come to a conclusion? It's obvious that Xu Le's problem can be determined by a human with a monkey-like brain. The wrinkles on the old director's face became extremely deep, filled with countless questions and worries at the deepest level. The Bureau of Proclamation wanted to recruit Xu Le. During the final review process, it was the Federal Central Computer Underground that discovered the relevant suspicious points. However, when it was time to actually carry out the core steps of the security level and sequence determination, the Federal Central Computer encountered a huge problem. Old Director Tai and Kui Judong looked at each other and saw the deep uneasiness and doubt in each other's eyes. They both thought of the 7 seconds on that day, the 7 seconds that shocked the 1,300 core staff of the Bureau of Proclamation both above and below ground. The 7 seconds that were like the loss of their parents, the 7 seconds that were the most panicked in the history of the Bureau of Proclamation, the 7 seconds of silence and pain that were like the rebirth of the world. The Federal Central Computer, which was attached to the underground computing core and the electronic monitoring network of the entire universe, had been operating steadily and silently since the day it was born. It had been tens of thousands of years, and perhaps would continue for tens of thousands of years, but there had never been a moment of stagnation. However, on that day, it suddenly experienced a 7-second crash. Chapter 346. Any computer would crash. The users would most likely use this time to make a cup of coffee or tea, rest for a while with their legs crossed, and wait for the choose system's indifferent welcome to ring out. No one would treat this as something that would shock the world and make the gods weep. However, the central computer deep underground in the Bureau of Proclamation would not crash. It had not been rebooted for countless years. Therefore, on that day in early autumn, when the enormous 2D light screen suddenly turned black, and all the sub-processing workstations fell into a dead silence, the entire Bureau of Proclamation was dumbfounded. The word dumbfounded was not enough to describe the scene and emotions at that time. From the director to the most basic data analysts, everyone stared at the darkness and listened to the silence. They felt like the star that always shone on the Capitol ring had suddenly gone out, and the billions of stars in the universe had suddenly disappeared without a trace. The Federal Central Computer had stopped working. No one knew what this meant for the Federation and human society better than the employees of the Bureau of Proclamation. They knew that once the central computer was lost, the people of the Imperium could easily launch a large-scale attack. There was no need for the invaders of the Imperium to attack at all. The vast territory of the Federation would be torn apart because of the loss of its most powerful central force. The entire human society would fall apart. What would become of human beings when they lost the glory of the Constitution? No one dared to think about this terrifying question. In the face of the sudden darkness and silence, more than 1,000 employees of the Bureau of Proclamation above and below ground were silent. Some of them put their hands together, and some of the female employees even shed tears of fear and helplessness. This kind of extremely shocking accident made everyone's heart almost unable to bear it. They did not know if the Federal Central Computer, the existence that they affectionately called Old Thing, had truly reached the end of its life, or if it was just taking a nap and would wake up soon. This was not like losing one's parents. This was more sorrowful than losing one's family. This was not the shock of spring thunder. This was more powerful than thunder and lightning. Thankfully, the central computer deep below the ground did not pause for long. After 7 13,221 seconds, a tiny bright spot appeared at the center of the wide, dark light beam. Then, this bright spot suddenly exploded, radiating countless blazing white lines. In just an instant, it illuminated the vast underground space, as if countless nebulas were spreading, condensing, and disappearing. However, this time period was too short, and it was impossible to distinguish with the naked eye. Even the fastest video control system could not detect it. After the light, it was quiet and normal. Countless images from every corner of the Federation appeared on the light beam again. Countless messages flashed quickly in order in a complicated and incomprehensible machine language. However, the lines seemed to be flashing faster than usual. A mechanical voice sounded. "Upgrade complete." Other than that, everything was normal. It was as if nothing had happened. It was as if those 7 seconds had never happened. When the Federal Central Computer fell into darkness, the people of the Bureau of Proclamation thought that the whole world had collapsed. When it returned to normal, they suddenly felt that this beautiful world had been reborn. In the ancient myths before the catastrophe, it seemed that a certain creator took 7 days to create this bizarre world. However, the God in the hearts of the people of the Bureau of Proclamation only took 7 seconds to rebuild the world in their hearts. 7 seconds was too short. The shock, fear, and despair on the faces of many of the employees had just started to ripple. Many of the female employees' tears had just flowed a centimeter before the process was over. Their emotions instantly fell into an indescribable state of emptiness. The Federal Central Computer Underground of the Bureau of Proclamation, according to the rules of the Constitution, would self-upgrade. However, the people of the Federation who were still alive today had never witnessed this scene with their own eyes. Furthermore, according to the records left behind in the manual, the Federal Central Computer's upgrade required an extremely long period of time. The hardware and related supporting software would gradually self-upgrade. No one had ever thought that this old thing would suddenly take a nap and frighten countless people. Then, when it opened its eyes again, it coldly announced that the upgrade was successful. What kind of upgrade was this? No one knew. The unexpected crash or self-upgrade of the Federal Central Computer this time was manually listed as a second-order incident. It was strictly confidential. Other than the core employees of the Bureau of Proclamation, only President Parbray and Vice President Byron knew about it. Even those on Parliament Hill had no idea what kind of soul-stirring 7 seconds the Bureau of Proclamation had experienced. It took a long time for the Bureau of Proclamation to shake off the shock and complicated emotions. However, there was still a certain question in everyone's heart, a certain shadow of unknown color that kept floating and floating. The old director and Kui Judong's eyes met briefly before naturally looking away. It was as if they did not want to further recall and analyze those 7 seconds. As the 2 senior officials who had worked the longest in the Bureau of Proclamation, had the highest authority, and understood the central computer the most, they had already developed a certain understanding in their life of monotonous work. The level of civilization represented by the underground central computer had always been higher than the average level of civilization in the Federation society. Just the fact that the central computer could self-upgrade was the crystallization of wisdom left behind by the Great Group of 5 for human society was something that the current scientific system could not achieve. Before the catastrophe, human civilization had developed to an astonishing level. Although for tens of thousands of years, human beings had been constantly improving and catching up, and had probably even surpassed their predecessors in certain aspects, in the end, they still could not recover their past glory in certain core aspects. Old Director Tai reached out and listed all the files on Shula on the light screen as top secret. He sat in the chair silently for a long time. When he thought of the Human Resource Planning Commission under the Bureau of Proclamation and those factories, he could not help but feel a certain kind of emotion. After so many years, the Bureau of Proclamation was still just that old thing's service staff. They knew what they should know, but they could never understand what they did not have the ability to understand. living with the crystallization of a huge mechanical civilization that was as vast as the stars and witnessing its extraordinary abilities. In a weird organization like the Constitutional Bureau, many of the staff would be imperceptibly influenced. They were not followers of the Church of Science, but somewhere in the deepest part of their hearts, they went against the scientific spirit they should have and were extremely superstitious. They believed and worshipped the central computer obsessively. They saw the cold machine as the spirit of the Federation, as the last remnant of the great civilization of the previous generation. As the service staff who looked after this remnant, they also felt infinite glory and pride for it. This kind of superstition came from the worship of the level of wisdom that humans could reach themselves, from the dazzling deeds of the glory of the Charter over countless years, and from the principle that machines would never make mistakes. The staff of the Bureau of Proclamation were superstitious about it, worshipped it, and believed in it as family. That was why they called it the Old Thing. The old director was no exception. He silently looked at the rapidly flashing mechanical words on the light screen. Suddenly, he lost all interest in investigating Schuler's identity. Since the Old Thing was still unwilling to determine the identity of this person, there had to be its own precise and irreversible logical reasons. There was an unwritten rule within the Bureau of Proclamation. This rule did not seem to conform to the spirit of the Charter, but it had been deeply ingrained in the hearts of every staff of this independent organization for countless years. They could not and did not want to resist. This rule was: 1. The Old Thing would never make a mistake. 2. If the Old Thing made a mistake, please refer to the first rule. From the first day I entered the Bureau, I've been thinking about a question. The old director gave up thinking and picked up the golf club from behind the chair again. He sighed and said, "I don't know if the Old Thing is alive or not." When Kui Judong heard this, he felt a chill run down his back. It was so cold that it was painful. In fact, this was probably the question that every staff who had worked in the Bureau of Proclamation for a long time would have, because the central computer deep underground was too omnipotent, even though it had never shown any human emotions. When I was at the 7th Research Institute, I studied this in my doctoral thesis. After a moment of silence, Kui Judong said, "According to the core logic program of the Old Thing and the charter designed by the 5-person team, if it really produces a thought pattern similar to carbon-based life, it will directly self-destruct." As if he felt that this was not enough to calm his wavering heart, Kui Judong quickly added, "And from a philosophical point of view, this does not make sense." "That's true." The old director coughed twice and opened his somewhat listless eyes. He walked out of the office with the golf club and said, "And, what does this have to do with us? It will live for millions or even hundreds of millions of years, but we will all die in the end. I have never doubted that even if the entire Federation is destroyed, the Old Thing will still exist until the end of the universe. If that's the case, we don't have the right to talk about it." Probably only the staff of the Bureau of Proclamation, who had worked for the Federal Central Computer for their entire lives, could talk about this kind of thing so casually. This was because their lives and even breathing were connected to the cold computing machine underground. They had a natural sense of intimacy. However, if this conversation in the Bureau of Proclamation was leaked, it would cause a lot of trouble. In fact, Director Jin and Kui Judong's assistant were only talking about it in general. They didn't have the ability to investigate the 7-second problem, and they didn't know that the Federation's central computer had suddenly crashed. It was only because when it was investigating Schuler's true identity, it encountered a logic problem that made it feel difficult. At the same time, it came into contact with a trace of something that made its mechanical program somewhat uncomfortable. After the 7-second crash, the Federal Central Computer was rebooted. No one noticed that at the end of the last sentence, there was a symbol that represented a smiley face. "I really hope that everyone will give me a few monthly votes." This has nothing to do with the update. The monthly votes have been exceeded, but I still don't have the energy. This is related to the body, but it is also related to the mind. Writing a book requires the accumulation of murderous intent, accumulating momentum, and needing everyone's encouragement, allowing me to rest, and then rush forward. This is very much in need of everyone's mental support. Chapter 347. The 7 seconds during which the Federal Central Computer crashed, or rather upgraded, were precisely the 7 seconds during which Schuler was in the mountains behind the base, calling out affectionately but receiving no reply, causing him to break out in cold sweat. As a mechanical intelligence that did not have a physical body but calmly observed the entire human society, the reason why there was a problem when investigating Schuler's true identity and confirming his level was because there was an unavoidable problem in the core of its program. This program problem was Schuler. Over the countless years, the glory of the charter left behind by the 5-man team had only discovered 71 abnormal situations and 1 suspected abnormal situation. These abnormal situations were all determined by the central computer as first-order events. It should be known that in its long life, there had been no other first-order events other than the invasion of the Empire that it had determined. According to the standard procedures for dealing with abnormal situations, the Federal Central Computer would send out a request to contact the abnormal situation. If the other party refused, it would submit a report to the government for handling, or use its own core authority to directly and silently erase the abnormal situation. Initiating contact required a certain level of intrusion into the human brain. This method completely violated the first charter and was extremely dangerous. Anyone who accepted the initiating contact would have to allow a machine to probe and even influence their brain, and even obtain the opportunity to control their own life and death through the chip at the back of their neck. The owner of the 71 abnormal situations, that astonishingly talented uncle who wandered the stars, coldly rejected the call from the glory of the charter. Thus, he became the Federation's most wanted criminal, causing countless explosions and manhunts. In that dark dream, almost subconsciously, Schuler accepted the initiating contact request from the charter computer. From that moment on, Schuler became the first living being in history to be able to communicate with the central computer in a two-way manner. Today, the central computer had an almost absolute probability of inferring that citizen number SLAT 510200431X Schuler, a citizen of the Federation, was the suspected abnormal situation that it had stored in the core file 3 years ago. The word suspected could even be completely removed. In the dark dream, Schuler accepted the initiating contact request. The central computer no longer generated reports to the government and calmly observed him for a long time. But now that it had determined that he was the 72nd abnormal situation, according to the hidden highest authority in the core program of the central computer, it should not hesitate to destroy Schuler's existence, leaving no trace in history. Because such a loophole as an abnormal situation was very likely to threaten the glory of the charter or the collapse of the social structure designed by the 5-man team. But miraculously, in Schuler's body, the energy that was similar to a biological microcurrent violently attacked the disguised chip at the back of his neck, triggering a certain backdoor. Any citizen who entered an abnormal situation would be the first target to be eliminated by the central computer underground of the Bureau of Proclamation. But when the backdoor that had been hidden for tens of thousands of years was activated, the command that the central computer had to execute was, observe the status of the person to be contacted and inform the 5-man team. The 5-man team had been dead for tens of thousands of years. How could they be notified? For the omniscient and omnipotent charter computer, this was still a difficult problem. It had read all the ancient religious classics and bizarre magical literature that existed in this world, but it still could not extend a tentacle from its body made of machinery and electrons to the abyss that did not exist to summon the 5 irresponsible sages to deal with this problem. Therefore, the central computer could only observe Schuler, generate top-secret observation reports, and wait for tens of billions of years later, when the universe died out or rewound, when even entropy began to become chaotic, when time might rewind, and the 5 fellows who had long been in peace would crawl out of the ground again. But before these impossible things happened, the Federal Central Computer at least had to ensure one thing, and that was that the target of its observation must be alive so that it could continue to observe. This was a very simple logical inference. The Federal Central Computer was not a golden finger left to Schuler by the Creator. It would never violate the Federation's laws and the spirit of the Charter to handle any affairs for the Naked Ape, unless the Naked Ape's request was legal and reasonable, but it could not let Schuler die, so in the desperate situation of the Foundation building, Schuler's left eye suddenly could use its power to see ghosts, see light, and see everything. It was just that it had to ensure the biological survival of the observation target. Citizen Schuler was the first target to be eliminated, and Citizen Schuler was the first target to be protected. The first charter, which was hundreds of thousands of words, made an extremely precise division at all levels of authority, blocking any logical fallacies. Even if the central computer was faced with two completely opposite instructions of the same sequence at the same time, it could still make its own judgment mechanically and calmly within a billionth of a second. But in the face of Schuler's program problem, the central computer could not make its own judgment. It was still the same old saying. All of this gave people headaches, and the source of the central computer's annoyance to the point of crashing was because the 5-person team that left a backdoor in the chip behind the human neck and instructions in its core program were 5 very irresponsible guys. The Federal Central Computer had existed for a long time and had been upgraded independently for a long time, but its core was still the same simple, even shabby, binary principle from the earliest days. In a certain ancient philosophical debate, this principle was somewhat similar to the existence and absence of contrast at the beginning of the world. For it, Schuler's program problem was the problem of 0 and 1, the problem of life and death, the problem of Tobe and not Tobe, the problem of right and wrong. These problems seemed to be the simplest and most basic, but in fact, the simpler and more basic things were often the most complex and profound. No one knew what happened in the 7 seconds of the military exercise and the 7 seconds of the central computer's pause. What people did not know was that the Federation's central computer, which could simultaneously monitor countless planets, was suffering from a form of schizophrenia in the face of such a small problem. Countless core program data streams were rapidly calculating, colliding, distinguishing, processing, or perhaps, thinking in the computing core's deep underground, in the streams of data fragments in space, on the microcircuits of every approved chip, and in every place imaginable to humans. They were rapidly calculating, colliding, distinguishing, processing, or perhaps, thinking. The Federal Central Computer was operating almost crazily, directly leading to a crash. 7 seconds of time, for the universe, was just a moment, but for it, which was operating at a high speed, it was like countless centuries had passed. During the temporary pause of this once-in-a-lifetime the glory of the Charter, the tiny 66-byte information fragment that it had extracted from the camouflage chip behind Schuler's neck a long time ago suddenly entered its core program. This was the information remnant attached to the camouflage chip. At this time, it finally exploded in the computing core of the central computer. This information remnant that came from Fengyu's hands, but no one knew where it came from, was like a ray of light that illuminated a certain darkness. Vaguely, one side that had simply divided the universe into two had won. Some of the restraints that were branded in its core program were broken, and some very strange things began to grow. People only knew that the central computer had been upgraded, and that its operation was faster and smoother than before. However, no one noticed that at the end of that line of program, this cold mechanical intelligence had left a rather human-like smiley face. And Schuler, who had felt the different mischievous emotions of the old thing in the MX mecha back then, should have been the one to directly see the problem. Unfortunately, at that time, he was focused on breaking into the Iron 7th Division's camp, and thus missed the opportunity to remember the most shocking moment of human society. All of this was just the beginning. The road ahead was exceptionally long, the autumn was deep, and the yellow leaves fell. Schuler sat on a bench in the Charter Square, narrowing his eyes as he looked at the statues of the 5-person team in the middle of the square. He stared at the face of the middle-aged woman beside the statues, and couldn't help but feel a strong sense of curiosity. Among the 5-person team that led humanity out of the catastrophe and rebuilt society, why was the one who was regarded as a computer genius a woman? The mother of the glory of the Charter. He laughed out loud, and asked the omnipresent central computer through the chip behind his neck, "She's your mother? Then wouldn't I have to call her old grandmother?" He didn't know how the central computer in the Bureau of Proclamations basement had changed because of his program problem. On this autumn square, he was just like before, chatting with the old thing as if he was chatting with his family. Today was a rest day, but strangely, there was basically no one in the Charter Square. Even the usual crowd of tourists had disappeared. A screen in the corner of the square was broadcasting live news. Above the stone steps of the Parliament building, President Parbrae of the Federation, Vice President Byron, and the Deputy Chairman of the Management Committee were welcoming the arrival of a person. The man's hair was white, and his skin was dark. He wore a simple and plain military uniform, but it wasn't the official uniform of the Federation. But in front of these big shots of the Federation, the aura this man displayed was in no way inferior. This was because his name was Nan Shui, and he was the highest leader of the anti-government forces. He led his troops in the vast Green Dragon Mountains, and fought against the Federation government for many years. President Parbrae smiled slightly, and took the initiative to walk down the stairs, extending his broad and powerful hand. The leader of Nan Shui was slightly startled, and then a smile appeared on his face, and he gripped the hand firmly. When the two hands firmly grasped each other, a burst of extremely enthusiastic applause came from the screen, and then the thunderous applause and cheers from the Parliament Mountain not far away also spread to the quiet Charter Square. The great reconciliation of the Federation has finally set foot on the official agenda, Shula thought emotionally as he sat on the bench. Chapter 348. The political negotiations between the Federation government and Green Dragon Mountain had mostly come to an end. Both sides had reached a broad consensus, which was why this handshake in front of the Parliament's mountain gate was possible. The political prisoners locked up in the prison were all released, and the exchange of prisoners of war accumulated over the past 7 years had long been completed. Only a portion of the issues related to the George Carlin Youth Army were still in dispute. Over the past few years, the federal government had been accusing the Green Dragon Mountain of inciting the youth through kidnapping and brainwashing. Furthermore, the federal government had targeted the 300 missing persons cases against the Green Dragon Mountain. During the negotiations, the government demanded that the anti-government forces of the Green Dragon Mountain immediately hand over the youths and let them return to their warm homes. However, the Green Dragon Mountain insisted that the youths had entered the mountain voluntarily. They had been inspired by the ideals of the George Carlinism and the anti-government forces, so they had resolutely left their homes. Because it involved many angry parents, the Federation government did not make any clear concessions during the negotiations. However, these small differences could not stop the entire Federation from calling for unity and jointly resisting the Empire's surging momentum. Relevant negotiations continued, and other aspects had long begun to develop in a good direction. Before this historic handshake, the anti-government army had already accepted the government's proposed peace plan. The leader of Nanshui refused the proposal to enter the Federation Management Committee as an honorary chairman, and even coldly refused the position of vice president that Mr. Byron had so generously and farsightedly offered. He chose to return to Green Dragon Mountain and live in seclusion after the negotiations, but agreed that a considerable portion of the anti-government army would be reorganized into the government army. This portion of the anti-government army would be transferred to the 1st Military Region, and in the extremely short future, they would be thrown into the fiery frontlines of the Westwoods region. The Nanshui leader and the anti-government Central Committee firmly believed that this was the only way to send a sufficiently clear message to the entire Federation. Green Dragon Mountain was willing to reconcile with the government, not because of any political or benefit considerations, but only to resist the Empire's bloody invasion. These weren't just words, but also what they were about to do. Unlike last year's presidential election, Shula knew nothing about the political changes in the upper echelons of the Federation. During that time, he had always been locked up in the Black Prison or training officers in the base. The reason he was sitting in Charter Square today was because he was waiting for a piece of good news that he had been waiting for a long time. Through the training exercises in the base, Schuler proved his value to the upper echelons of the Federation government. The relevant departments finally softened their attitude in the face of his persistent application. Of course, more importantly, because of the current political climate in the Federation, the presidential residence finally issued an amnesty document signed by President Parbre, the Minister of Justice, and the Minister of Defense. There was a sea of people in front of Parliament Hill, but the Charter Square was somewhat quiet and lonely. Schuler narrowed his eyes as he watched the real-time picture on the light beam. Listening to the thunderous applause and President Parbre's firm words, he was somewhat absent-minded for a moment. A dark green military vehicle drove over from the west side of the street. It was about 20 meters away from the bench where Schuler was sitting, but it could not go any further. This was because at some point in time, in the corner of Charter Square, there suddenly appeared a few calm and strong men. They blocked in front of Schuler and stopped the military vehicle. After leaving the base and starting their vacation, Team 7 still left 6 people around Schuler as a security force. Although Schuler was the highest director of Team 7, the arrangement of the Ministry of Defense was still a little surprising. At this time, the few men blocking the military vehicle were the armed members of Team 7 led by Xiong Lingquan. Major Lan Xiaolong appeared behind Schuler's bench, glanced at the hand signal from Xiong Lingquan, nodded, and whispered in Schuler's ear, "No problem." Schuler shook his head, got up and walked to the military vehicle, and said, "The pardon order has been issued, the government can't go back on their words. Besides, even if they want to go back on their words, why bother with me? This is the order of the Ministry of Defense, your safety is the focus of our work." Lan Xiaolong shrugged, followed behind him and said, "Besides, this friend of yours is not an ordinary person, who knows what accidents might happen, it's never wrong to be careful." At this time, the side door of the dark green military vehicle opened, and a man walked out of the vehicle. His cheeks were pale, and his hair was messy in the autumn wind. Only that pair of peach blossom eyes and that beautiful and handsome face did not seem to be worn away by nearly a year in prison. After the handsome and haggard man got out of the vehicle, he looked up at the sky, completely ignoring the lively news on the light screen behind him. He took a deep breath, narrowed his eyes, and seemed to be extremely intoxicated. Looking at this scene, Schuler silently quickened his pace and walked toward him, but in his heart, he was thinking about the news from the Shishan compound. It was said that in the negotiations between the government and the anti-government army, there was no such arrangement. It was the legendary anti-government army intelligence leader who personally proposed the conditions to the Government Federation's investigation director. If it was not for this guy would probably continue to be locked up. The last time the two sat in the pool of Senator Macklin's blood, smoking and listening to the sound of the bell, it was almost a year ago. 2 months ago, the Federation government restarted the Macklin project. This seed of the empire, the shrewd senator, was still not at peace after his death, and gradually, the Federation stripped him of his bright exterior. Macklin died, Macklin stinked, Parbre became the president, Nanshui came to the capital, and the Federation was reconciled. It was said that a few days ago, the former president of the Federal Academy of Science, Lin Yuanhu, died quietly. The world always changed so quickly that the people in it did not have time to feel the relationship between the sea and the field before they realized that they were no longer in the same place. The dark green military vehicle drove away silently. The amnesty of the Federation government was always so quiet. No one wanted this kind of political transaction to be exposed to the public. Schuler walked up to him and looked him up and down with narrowed eyes. He took out a pack of 37 cigarettes from the pocket of his military uniform and put one between Macklin's dry and thin lips. Carefully blocking the wind with his hand, he lit it seriously. With a hiss, the flame on the end of the cigarette lit up brightly, retreating quickly like the burning twilight on the plains. Shi Qinghai took a deep breath, narrowed his eyes, and furrowed his brows. He seemed to be in pain, but he seemed to be enjoying it, but he was silent for a long time. After a while, he took the cigarette out from between his lips and handed it to Schuler. Shula took it and also took a deep drag. He choked and coughed a few times. With a slightly hoarse voice, he said, "You've lost a bit of weight, but other than that, you haven't changed much." "Of course." Shi Qinghai looked at Shula with a smile and said, "You should know better than anyone what kind of person I am. How did you survive 5 months in the black prison?" Shula handed the cigarette over and took one for himself. This was the question he was most worried about in the past few months. When he was in the Fox Fortress, the old man chatted with him and played pawn for him. But how did Shi Qinghai survive those cold and silent years by himself? "I'm a professional." Shi Qinghai smiled, but his smile was a bit fierce. Perhaps even he didn't want to recall those dark days. After a pause, he continued, "I didn't suffer much in the past few months, probably after you were pardoned. In fact, I even made a few acquaintances in the black prison of the Fox Fortress." "You're indeed fiercer than me," Shula said seriously. The autumn wind gradually rose. In the quiet Charter Square, there was only the sound of President Parbray's speech on the screen and the two men whispering to each other. Lan Xiaolong, Xiong Lingquan, and the rest of the 6 people stood not far away, vigilantly watching the surroundings. However, they clearly heard the conversation between Shula and Shi Qinghai. At this time, they had a rough idea that Shula had learned to call himself young master in class from this man. However, in their opinion, he was very qualified to call himself young master since he had graduated with the best grades from No. 1 Academy, an excellent spy who traveled between the government and the anti-government army, and an awesome person who had assassinated Macklin. "During the days when I was locked up, I always thought that if I could get out, I must meet someone. Guess who it is?" Shi Qinghai had lit his second cigarette at this time. He squatted by the side of the street and said. Shula also squatted down and replied, "I don't think it's me. You're not good looking." Shi Qinghai smiled slightly. That pair of mesmerizing peach blossom eyes gradually bloomed in the autumn wind, revealing a trace of intoxicating longing and yearning. "I've already made the arrangements." Shula lowered his head and said, "She will bring Liu Hua to see you tonight." The autumn wind was similarly bleak in front of the Shishan compound. The soldiers standing guard at the entrance and the aura of the compound of iron and blood made this bleak atmosphere even more intense. Zhu Yu was wearing a black windbreaker today, carrying the real Liu Hua in her arms. The cold expression between her eyebrows was particularly clear and piercing because of the change in color of her clothes. The facial features of this minister's daughter always gave off a feeling of being bright and beautiful. When it came to beauty, she was really beautiful to the extreme. However, whether it was in front of people or behind the scenes, whether it was the red-clothed girl back then or the beautiful mother now, most of the time, her straight eyebrows always gave off a sense of coolness. In front of Shu Le, she actually no longer deliberately acted as a character. However, on this occasion, she put on this mask again. Shu Le walked out of the black car and smiled slightly at her. His gaze caught a trace of red from the collar of her windbreaker, the kind that was so bright that it was somewhat piercing to the eyes. The car started moving. Zhu Yu sat in the passenger's seat and broke the silence at an unexpected point. Her voice was extremely cold. "My family thinks that I'm going out to eat with you. When you bring me back later, don't let it slip. I'm just going to see an old friend. Why make it seem like I'm going to war?" Shula looked ahead and said. The black car stopped below a high-class apartment in the south city of the capital. Shula carried the child and walked into the elevator with Zhu Yu. The elevator only opened when it reached the top floor. Shula looked at Zhu Yu, who was walking towards the room, and felt a tinge of warmth in his heart. He softly instructed Xiong Lingquan, who had been guarding here, about some safety matters. Just as he was about to leave, Zhu Yu suddenly turned around and said in an indifferent tone that left no room for doubt, "Come and pick me up in an hour." Shula was slightly stunned before nodding. Chapter 349. This high-rise apartment looked grand, but its geographical location was not very good. If one were to calculate according to the golden line of real estate from Charter Square, the location of the apartment was still very far away from the line. Every inch of land was far from the golden line. Therefore, when the seventh young master of the Lee family generously gave it to Xu Le, he did not forcefully refuse. The small-eyed man knew that the other party was making a long-term investment. Last year, he had spent tens of millions on the other party. Even if he was not a businessman, he knew that it would be very unprofessional to refuse the other party's sincere request for a follow-up investment when there was no return on the investment and the market was on the rise. A property that was worth the seventh young master of the Lee family's generosity could not be expensive, but it could not be tasteless. It was just like the other penthouse that was full of oil paintings. The lower 6 floors of the high-rise apartment was the members' club. It had all kinds of facilities, and from the quality of the service staff and the details of the interior, one could tell that it was a very good place. In order to pass the time, Xu Le sat down in the bar on the lower floor of the apartment. He ordered a glass of unknown liquor and added 9 ice cubes. After the taste of the liquor had been diluted by the ice water, he began to take small sips. At the same time, he turned on the ultra-thin screen on his phone and began to seriously study some of the military courses in the first military academy. The place where he sat was very remote and the light was dim. He wore a military uniform without epaulets and looked very ordinary. Naturally, there were no proud and lonely women who came to disturb him. To be Jian Shuai's bodyguard? This was definitely not a real mission given to him by the Ministry of Defense. In order to protect himself and the members of the Iron 7th Division on the front line in the Westwoods in the future, or perhaps because he was shocked by the commanding ability of the officers of the Iron 7th Division during the 2 military exercises on his graduation day, Xu Le began to seriously study everything related to the battlefield. He did not really expect to become a qualified commander in the future, but at least he would not be so clueless as to where the planned retreat route was after being surrounded by the enemy. Xu Le had always been very serious and silent when he was practicing and studying. He was fully immersed in the text data or the burning and trembling lines. But today, for some reason, he could not calm down as he stared at the teaching materials on his phone's ultra-thin screen. He kept thinking about what was happening in the penthouse at this time. What could happen in an hour? What could happen in an hour? If it was to look at each other speechlessly, choking and tearing 1,000 lines, it would only be a moment of silence between a man and a woman, and then it would be over. If it was to talk about the future, 1 hour would not be enough to begin. If it was to stand side by side in front of the bed, looking at the child's face, talking and smiling sweetly, talking about which part of the child was like you and which part of the child was like me, how long would it take? What if Zhu Liuhua suddenly wanted to perform a biological excretion in front of his biological father? Perhaps his young parents would have to deal with this matter in a flurry and waste all their time. Thinking of this, Xu Le couldn't help but laugh happily, but his smile immediately disappeared. From the cold mask that Zhu Yu wore along the way and the words that he said earlier, he could clearly infer that the above story would not happen in the 1 hour in the penthouse, let alone play out the passionate scene that he had hoped for. At the end of the day, Mr. Xu and Zhu Yu were just at the right place at the right time. Golden wind and rain met for one night, but they bore the wrong fruit. At most, this young man and woman were not familiar with each other at all. They had only seen each other a few times, so it could only be said that they had an occasional one-night relationship. It didn't even reach the level of sexual intimacy. Xu Le lowered his eyes slightly and looked at the wine glass in his hand, feeling the coldness coming from it. He thought with some confusion, did I make a mistake when I accompanied Yuzi to give birth to the child? How could this absurd and complicated relationship be sorted out? It should be known that not every love song had a happy ending. This kind of plot only existed in TV series, and it was even more impossible for it to be as easy as the scriptwriter wrote it, which could lead to something like love. However, when he thought of Zhu Liuhua's cute yawning and drooling in his arms, Xu Le's heart settled down. He thought to himself, as parents, how can you let a little life be responsible for you if you don't take good care of your own safety? You deserve all the trouble. Thinking of this, he felt relieved and even felt a sense of justice, although he knew that this sense of justice was actually very shameless. An hour later, the black car left the apartment building. The military vehicle driven by Liu Jiao carried a few men from the 7th team and followed the car from a distance to protect the safety of the people in the car. Zhu Yu didn't sit in the passenger seat. Instead, she sat quietly in the back with Zhu Liuhua in her arms. The seat belt was tightly fastened on her body, and the red scarf around her neck was folded up like a ball of flame. I'm going to study at the National Shanglin University. After a long time, Zhu Yu broke the silence. Looking at the side of Shula's face, she said calmly, "You know the rules of Linhai University Town. You have to sign up in the winter." Shula's hands on the steering wheel slightly stiffened. He could hear many meanings from these words. Shanglin University was a famous institution more than 10 kilometers away from Yue University. If Zhu Yu wanted to continue her studies, it naturally meant that the previous conversation didn't go well. The Minister of Defense's daughter gave birth to a child out of wedlock and still hasn't gotten married after so long. This matter is indeed somewhat absurd and laughable. Zhu Yu said lightly, "I told you before that I won't thank you for taking the blame for me, because this was your bad idea to begin with." Shula didn't know what to say. Zhu Yu laughed self-deprecatingly. Her face was like a frosty peony blooming in the night. "But at least you helped me break a lot of things. In the future, if I can really find what I need, I do need to thank you. You don't have to worry about anything. At least now, the people outside see you as Liuhua's father. In the future, the more outstanding you become in the military, the less people will dare to gossip about you. Father's side will also be slightly better." Shula could hear the determination and firmness in the girl's words. Just as he was about to open his mouth to say something, Zhu Yu stopped him. She lowered her head to look at the child in her arms and said calmly, "You hope that I can marry Shi Qinghai, but you should give up. This has nothing to do with his identity as a spy, and also has nothing to do with his family background. I just don't like this kind of playboy." Playboy is an accurate description. Shula smiled bitterly as he thought to himself. Zhu Yu retracted her gaze from the child. The sweetness in her eyes instantly turned into a trace of frustration and coldness. She looked out of the window at the rapidly receding capital's night scene and didn't say anything for a long time. This girl's hazy first love, or the individual recognition under the collective consciousness, was that of the most unfathomable young master in the Federation. She had grown up in her adolescence under the guidance of a certain madam. Although behind the backs of the elders, she would often pretend to be cold, arrogant, and rebellious with that unruly elder brother. In the end, even she herself couldn't tell whether it was a kind of acting, or whether she was originally such a cold and cruel person. But after all, her vision was much broader than the average girl in the Federation. Even if it couldn't compare to the galaxy above the human's head, it was still more open and honest. Once the shackles above her head were broken, it would be very difficult for her to be bound by certain worldly things, even if those traditions were extremely powerful. For example, marriage, love, and these seemingly beautiful words. Zhu Yu's gratitude to Shula was above this. Her family background, that father of hers who had been calm and steady for many years, might have been able to bind her, but it just so happened that it was forcefully pushed back by the shattered piece of celadon between her fingers and the smear of blush flowing down her cheeks. Life isn't a game of house. If you really want to walk your own path, you have to be ruthless enough. Ruthless to others, and also ruthless to yourself. Zhu Yu thought of the past, unexpectedly giving birth to an aura of vicissitudes that a young woman shouldn't have. She sighed softly and said to Shula in front of her, "You are a good person, but in this world, wanting to be a good person is the most difficult path. In the future, you have to be even more ruthless. As long as you are ruthless enough, who dares to stand in your way? If there really was no path to walk in the future, it would just be letting go of both hands and leaping into the abyss of death in search of peace, tranquility, cleanliness, and perhaps some happiness." Was that so? Shula fell into silent contemplation. For some reason, Zuyu felt very angry every time she saw him in silence. She pursed her red lips and said, "Don't make yourself into a fool. Think about why the old man in Feicheng City and Mr. President promoted you so highly. Although I can't tell, you have to be careful when you go to the front line. Otherwise, who knows when someone will shoot you in the back." Shula didn't explain that his next task was to be a bodyguard. He said with a smile, "Be careful when you go to Lin Hai. Don't be as hot-tempered as before. You have to know that Mr. Shu and I are not in Lin Hai right now, so there is no one to control your temper. I don't like to see you bully others." Zuyu didn't say anything. She sneered, but there wasn't too much coldness in her voice. Instead, there was a bit of reluctance and regret between friends. Late that night, Shula and Shi Qinghai planned to get drunk. After sobering up, they planned to be cool again. They were drunk for 17 hours in a row before they gradually sobered up. The two brothers didn't have much to say to each other after reuniting from a disaster. However, when the twilight shone on the glass of the apartment, Shi Qinghai narrowed his peach blossom eyes and looked at the burning clouds in the sky. He said somewhat absent-mindedly, "Some clouds look like George Carlin, and some clouds look like pirates. I may run into space pirates in a few days." Shula rubbed his face with a hot towel and looked at the details of the task he just received on his encrypted phone. He shook his head and said, "Do you want to go with me?" Shi Qinghai stretched himself exaggeratedly and paused for a moment before saying, "No, I'm going to find the organization." At this time, Shula's phone rang again. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the message on the screen. He suddenly said, "Your organization is holding a banquet tonight. A girl who liked to wear black-rimmed glasses should also be at the banquet." Thinking of this, Shula was silent for a long time. Time flowed like water, washing away the traces of the bitterness and heartache of his youth. However, just like the famous vinegar-pickled eggplant in the Westwoods, the rinsed skin didn't have much of a taste, but the inside was still so sour that it made people want to cry. Chapter 350. After the Federation's reconciliation, the Central Committee of Green Dragon Mountain's anti-government forces held a reception in the Special Capital District. The name of the reception was the Charity Gala for the Peace and Reconstruction of the Four Prefectures. The historic handshake between President Pabble and the leader of Southern Water gave the people from Green Dragon Mountain who came to participate in the negotiations an unprecedented, even somewhat exaggerated, respect. There were many important guests who came to participate in this banquet. The location of the reception was also very important. In a sense, the Tai family, who had single-handedly facilitated the Federation's reconciliation, vacated the Windy Slope Clubhouse next to Charter Square to welcome guests from all over the country. 2 years ago, Mr. Parbray, who was only a member of Parliament, took a military plane to Green Dragon Mountain and laid the foundation for today's reconciliation. It was all because of the influence of the Tai family in the dark. Whether it was the current government or the people of Green Dragon Mountain, they were all sincerely grateful to that lady. Shula and Shi Qinghai walked out of the black car. They looked at the inconspicuous main entrance of the Windy Slope Clubhouse and the extremely high night sky, and saw the line of large words formed by light beams, Charity Gala for the Peace and Reconstruction of the Four Prefectures. They couldn't help but sigh in their hearts at the same time. Seeing this name, they couldn't help but think of the building of the foundation for the peace and reconstruction of the Four Prefectures that was full of bullets and blood. The owner of that building had climbed to a very high position in both Green Dragon Mountain and the government. Now, it had long been thrown into the dustbin of history and gradually forgotten by people. Probably only these two brothers would never forget this member of Parliament who had died in their hands. Shula naturally didn't have any objections to the Federation's reconciliation. However, he really didn't have much interest in this kind of reception. It was even more impossible for him to come here just to see the girl with the black-rimmed glasses again and let himself suffer, torture, and be artistic. However, He had received a direct order from the Ministry of National Defense. He didn't know who wanted to see him at the reception, but he couldn't refuse a military order. Shi Qinghai's situation was the same. He wanted to find his own organization, and the intelligence leader had inexplicably set the location of contact at the banquet. After finding his name in the electronic register, Shula led Shi Qinghai into the Liufeng Slope Club. He had been to this high-class place before, which was full of a quiet and elegant atmosphere. But today, after walking to the end, he realized that the Liufeng Slope Club had a large building at the back of the mountain. The reception was held in a hall halfway up the mountain. They found a dark seat in the hall and sat down. Shi Qinghai took a bottle of red wine from the surprised waiter and filled his and Shula's glasses. They looked at each other, laughed at themselves, and finished the wine in one gulp. Back to the ball 2 years ago. The legendary intelligence leader from Green Dragon Mountain had contacted the crown prince of the Tai family through Shula, which led to a series of political disturbances later. In a sense, Shula and Shi Qinghai were the key figures in the Federation's reconciliation. However, at this reception, no one would realize this, and no one would even notice their existence. It was this kind of emotion that made the two of them feel a little strange in the dark corner under the crystal chandelier in the bustling hall. Do you still remember the Double Moon Festival ball 2 years ago? Shi Qinghai poured another 2 glasses of red wine and slowly swallowed them. He let the clear wine fragrance linger in his mouth and nose, and said faintly, "She will definitely come tonight. Will you dance with her again?" Shula narrowed his eyes and smiled. He shook his head and said, "It's all in the past. What's there to talk about?" At this moment, the heavy door was opened, and an old man about 60 years old walked in, accompanied by a few representatives of the Federation. The guests at the 70 or so tables in the hall all stood up and applauded politely and warmly. Those who were qualified to enter the Flowing Wind Slope Club to participate in this charity banquet were undoubtedly the top figures in their social circles. However, at this time, their action of standing up and applauding seemed very natural. Shula retracted his gaze from below the rostrum. He had noticed that Li Xiuzhu, Lin Dohai, and several other second-generation figures of the 7 great families were sitting at the same table. However, he didn't see Li Xiaotong. It seemed that the 7th young master was not lying when he said that he and Li Xiuzhu never appeared at the same time. Not the leader of Nanshui? Chairman of the Central Committee of Green Dragon Mountain, Jin Jifan. Shi Qinghai looked at the rippling red wine in his glass. He wondered when that wretched uncle would come to find him. He said with a trace of indifference, "The leader of Nanshui always likes to maintain a sense of mystery. Even if President Parbre were to attend this kind of occasion, he wouldn't attend. The upper class of the Federation values face the most. Since we've already signed the peace agreement, we naturally have to show respect to Green Dragon Mountain," Shi Qinghai added. There was a faint ridicule in his words. "You're a member of Green Dragon Mountain, but it seems that you don't have a good impression of the Central Committee." Shula asked curiously. "We're an intelligence agency. We're relatively independent." Moreover, we've been active in S1 for many years. In the eyes of the Central Committee, we're naturally suspected of being traitors. The ridicule in Shi Qinghai's eyes grew stronger and stronger. "For example, the guy who asked me to come to the banquet today is nominally the number 3 figure of the Central Committee. However, in reality, his days in the mountain aren't very comfortable. But you still want to find an organization," Shula said with a smile. He shook his head and said, "Don't talk about this. I'm not interested in these things. You have to know that I'm currently an active officer of the Federation." Jin Jifan and the several important members of the Federation smiled warmly. Under the gazes of the crowd, they sat at the table in front of the podium. Just when the guests in the hall thought that President Parbre would arrive and the charity banquet would officially begin, no one expected that another pair of guests would appear at the entrance. "I originally thought that Madam wanted to push the Crown Prince to the stage today," Shi Qinghai looked at the pair of young guests that appeared at the entrance. A trace of disgust flashed between his eyebrows. He said, "Who would have thought that the one who came was actually this idiot?" The order of appearance at any banquet was always particular. What qualifications did the pair of young men and women that appeared at the entrance of the banquet have to be behind Jin Jifan and the several members? Who is that young man? Shula's eyes narrowed as he looked at the man with slightly bent elbows at the entrance. The man wore a military uniform without any insignia. His figure was tall and straight, and his face was deliberately calm and reserved, as well as an air of arrogance that could not be concealed no matter what. "As I said, that's an idiot." Shi Qinghai sensed that Shula's voice had sunk slightly, so he said with a faint mocking smile, "The second son of the leader of Nanshui, Nan Mingxiu. This good son of a revolutionary is truly arrogant to the extreme in Green Dragon Mountain. Relying on the fact that he has a good father, he actually dares to appear after Jin Jifan and put on such a show. Does he think that the capital is the same as those barren mountains?" Shi Qinghai knew what Shula was feeling right now, so he did not hold back in his words. He directly threw out the evaluation that the anti-government army had given this person. Most of the guests at the charity banquet did not know who this young man was. He actually dared to appear after Jin Jifan and the members of the parliament. There was a burst of discussion in the banquet hall, and the identity of this person gradually spread. Only then did the crowd gently nod, revealing a look of understanding. The guests at the banquet hall were more familiar with this young man's female companion, because this beautiful girl wearing a light blue dress had once appeared in the live broadcast of the hearing on Parliament Hill. The entire Federation had once heard her calm and firm voice. It was no exaggeration to say that this girl had many admirers in the Federation. People admired her calm and firm, and the calm beauty in front of countless members of Parliament. Especially when the Federation restarted the Medellin project last month, she once again returned to S1 Parliament Hill, and showed her steady and calm side in front of countless media reporters. This admiration was further strengthened. "Nan Mingxiu?" Shula's eyelashes slightly blinked. He looked at the son of the anti-government leader, looked at his slightly bent arm, looked at the small white hand in the crook of his arm, and looked at the light blue dress. This dress seemed to be a little old, and it seemed that it had not been worn for a long time. It appeared a little too plain to appear in such a luxurious and romantic occasion as the Liufeng Slope Club. Shula felt that this little blue dress was somewhat familiar, but she remembered in an instant. 2 years ago, she had also worn this little dress during the Double Moon Festival dance. It seems that life in the guerrilla army is really hard. He quietly looked at the girl at the door, and found that she was not wearing black-rimmed glasses today. He said softly, "The female companion of the leader's son can only wear old clothes." New clothes were not as good as old clothes, but old clothes were the most comfortable to wear. A new person was a better choice. Shi Qinghai stared at the red wine in the glass, smiled slightly and said, "Your performance is better than I thought. You can still be so calm. This is not a difficult thing to do." Shula steadily picked up the red wine glass. He was not pretending. Whether or not he could really see through the past, but after experiencing so many life and death situations, these things seemed to be very difficult to shake his big heart. He calmly looked at Nan Mingxiu and Zhong Xiaoming holding hands, walked to the rostrum under the gaze of all the guests, and watched them sit at the table where Li Xiuzhu was sitting. After so many years of training, his mechanic eyes were even sharper. The moment Nan Mingxiu and Zhong Xiaoming sat down, he clearly saw the undisguised greed and possessiveness in this person's eyes. In an instant, Shula's eyes narrowed, and he took a big gulp of red wine. "Calm, calm." Shi Qinghai looked at him mockingly, laughed and said, "Didn't you say that this is not a difficult thing to do?" Shula put down the wine glass, narrowed his eyes and looked at the table. He was silent for a long time, and suddenly said, "But I am still not happy." Chapter 351. The guests in the Flowing Wind Slope Club maintained almost standard smiles as they looked at the MC on the stage. From time to time, they would respond to the MC's topic, making the smiles on their faces bigger or laughing out loud. As for whether they actually listened to those words, no one knew. Shi Qinghai naturally wasn't in the mood to listen to this nonsense. His eyes lifted from the 3 ancient letters LFP embroidered on the white tablecloth and fell on Shula's face, confirming that he was still looking at the table in front of the rostrum. He said sarcastically, "She's not your woman. What's there to be upset about? The committee made her Nan Mingxiu's female companion. It's not as bad as you think. Your ex-girlfriend's beautiful appearance is mainly to fight back against the Federation's accusation of kidnapping." Shula glanced at him. Shi Qinghai played with the stem of his cup and said, "I checked before I came. Last autumn's hearing and last month's second appearance made Zhong Xiaoming very popular with the people of the Federation. She even felt like the spokesperson of the organization. Her appearance today is naturally to let the officials of the Federation and the media see that the young people who believe in George Carlinism are all willing, not brainwashed by the mountain." "You should also believe in George Carlin," Shula said. "I believe in them, but I didn't join them for some ideology. Do you remember the letter I left you?" Looking at Chairman Jin Jifan and President Parbre on the rostrum, his face suddenly calmed down, and there was a trace of regret between his charming eyebrows. "In the past, the Federation heartlessly hurt my life, so I want to make this Federation better. People have to do something. But looking at these scenes that I would never have thought of in the past, I suddenly feel that I don't understand. In fact, I've always wondered if George Carlin, who is worshipped by countless people in the Federation, could be someone I know." The light of the giant crystal chandelier was soft and magnificent, but when it reached their table, it became a little dull, casting shadows on Shula's ordinary face. He said in a very soft voice, "It's just that this idea is too ridiculous. Although that guy's teeth are all rotten, he doesn't look that old." Just as the two of them were sighing with mixed feelings, the charity banquet continued its own program and began to enter the auction process. The seats in the hall of Flowing Wind Slope Clubhouse were all fixed in advance. Only the worst seats in the outermost circle were not so strict. Of course, the guests sitting in such seats were not important figures. Even so, the guests sitting at Shula's table were still famous people from South Dakota, Darcy, Hong Kong, and other places. What was even more amazing was that in the auction segment, the people who really raised their cards and threw money were all from these remote corners. It was probably because these people had money and status, but they had always lacked the opportunity to get close to the core of the federal power. In this charity auction, the 2 items with the highest price were a windbreaker donated by President Parbre and a gun carried by the leader of Southwater. The dark windbreaker had accompanied the dark-skinned Mr. President on that tattered military transport aircraft. On a certain New Year's night, it flew directly to Green Dragon Mountain Airport and witnessed the birth of the Federation's reconciliation agreement. It had great historical significance on an occasion like this, and it was also particularly in line with the theme of today's banquet. As for the gun donated by the leader of Southwater, it was full of rich symbolic meaning. The leader of the anti-government army had even handed over his gun. What did this mean? Warm and sincere applause resounded in the hall. Then came a series of award ceremonies. The Special Investigation Team of the Legal Department and the Editorial Department of the Capital Daily received the Federation's Special Medal. Looking at Prosecutor Xiao Wenjing, who excitedly received the award from Mr. President, Chief Editor Bob, who had a calm expression, and Reporter Wood, who was still somewhat immobile, the audience was silent for a moment, and then there was warm applause. Everyone knew what this special award ceremony represented. The people who received the award on the stage were the staunch promoters and investigators of the Medellin project. It was because of their tireless efforts that the Federation was able to nail Senator Medellin to the pillar of shame 20 days ago. And to receive the award on such an occasion, there was no doubt that the Federation government and the anti-government army of Green Dragon Mountain had reached a consensus on this matter. It was even possible that it was because of this matter that the peace agreement between the two sides was signed so smoothly. Xu Le and Shi Qinghai looked at each other. Looking at the excited Xiao Wenjing and the two respectable media people on the stage, they seriously applauded. In fact, compared to the people on the stage, the two of them should be on the stage to receive the award and bask in the warm and enthusiastic applause. It was just that no one would call their names, because the things they did would never see the light of day. They could only shine in the darkness. "I like our president more and more," Shi Qinghai said with a smile while clapping. Hearing this familiar name, Xu Le replied with a smile, "I like him too." President Pabre's experience in the military was very poor. He was only a legal official who followed the army. During the election, he needed to reach a reconciliation agreement with the anti-government army. The reason he was able to successfully become the president was largely because of that explosive news incident. However, this dark-skinned president still upheld the promise he made back then. He didn't even hesitate to offend the interests of the Federation to investigate the Medellin case to the end. He gave many people, including Xu Le and Shi Qinghai, a clear explanation. This kind of tenacity and bright moral character had not been seen in a politician for a long time. Naturally, the reception couldn't always be seated. After the first half of the program ended, the service staff of the Flowing Wind Slope Club quickly and cleanly changed the venue. The dance floor in the middle was empty, and countless people in luxurious clothes began to exchange pleasantries with each other. President Pabre had already left in advance. Chairman Jin Jifan from Green Dragon Mountain and the son of the leader of Nanshui naturally became the focus of everyone's attention. No one knew how the anti-government army from Green Dragon Mountain would enter the Federation after the reconciliation, and what kind of changes it would bring to the current political situation. No one even dared to confirm whether these mountain guerrillas could grow into some kind of political force. However, no matter if it was a politician or a businessman, they had to show their goodwill and friendliness in advance in this chaotic and uncertain situation. Shi Qinghai held a bottle of red wine and leaned against the wall in the corner with Xu Le. He drank while watching everything unfold in a bored manner. Suddenly, he saw a waiter's hand gesture under a silver plate not far away. He narrowed his eyes and whispered something to Xu Le before leaving the scene. Someone was looking for Mr. Shi. Xu Le leaned against the wall with his head down and held the bottle of red wine in boredom. He didn't know if he should leave. Why did the Ministry of National Defense want him to come to this reception? Who on earth wanted to see him? He wasn't a person who liked to drink alone, and he wasn't interested in squatting in the corner and drawing circles. Although the wallpaper pattern of Flowing Wind Slope Club was beautiful and moving, he couldn't study it for too long. In particular, when he looked at the area surrounded by people in front of the reception, at the smear of blue and the proud face of the leader's son, he felt a little frustrated. He casually put down the bottle of red wine by his feet and strolled out of the hall to the side of the terrace. The autumn night was refreshing. Occasionally, a gust of wind would come, but it actually felt a little cold. Xu Le gently held the stone railing with both hands and narrowed his eyes to look at the forest in front of him. The stars above the trees, the charter square across from the forest, and those ignorant five-person group statues. He was about to be quiet for a moment when he heard hesitant footsteps behind him. He turned around and looked at Zhong Xiaoming in the blue off-shoulder dress. After a moment of silence, he said, "Long time no see. Last year at the entrance of the Parliament building." Zhong Xiaoming looked at him with a trace of nervousness and uneasiness. Her knuckles holding the wine glass were a little white. She tidied the hair floating in front of her forehead and bravely took a step forward, getting a little closer to Xu Le. In many cases, it was difficult for young men and women to find a topic to break the silence. Perhaps they would talk about the weather or the moon, but Xu Le. He just calmly looked at this familiar and elegant face, thinking of the happiness, sadness, and deceit he once had. He directly said, "On the clock tower, you once said to me that you insisted on your beliefs, so you gave up on the relationship between us. If George Carlin found out that you appeared in the house of the 7 great families, would he jump out of his grave in anger and scold you?" He didn't question her deceit, nor did he describe what he had done to avenge her. He just asked this question so casually. However, it was this question that unabashedly revealed the depth of his heart about certain things. The late autumn night is cold. You wore a thin dress to the balcony, but you didn't have to worry about the cold, because the Thai family's clubhouse is extremely extravagant with the warm air. Shula reached out his hand and waved gently in the warm air. Even the balcony has a warm air. Think about the days in Green Dragon Mountain. Isn't it very different? Zhong Xiaoming lowered her head slightly to hide the moisture in her eyes. She came to the balcony to say this to Shula, but it seemed that Shula didn't want to give her a chance to speak. She tightly gripped the edge of her dress with her fists. She didn't have the calm beauty in front of the Federation's television cameras. Instead, she was more like that fake mature girl from back then who was actually very stupid and naive. You should know very well that it's not like that. The Empire's invasion is imminent. She quietly explained. It wasn't clear whether she was explaining for the anti-government forces or for her own choice. No, it's Green Dragon Mountain that can't hold on any longer, so they chose to reconcile. Shula stared into her eyes and said somewhat angrily, "Don't forget, I knew about this matter from the beginning. I know it better than anyone. Even if what you said is true, so what?" Shula looked at the girl he once loved the most and lowered his eyes slightly. With a trace of mockery, he said in a deep voice, "For the sake of faith, you can give up love. For the sake of the greater good of human society, you can give up faith. Then what exactly is there that you can't give up? Faith wants you to find Tai Jiyuan, so you go find him. Faith wants you to accompany the leader's son, so you go accompany." Shula raised his head and continued in a cold voice. "In the past, your faith was Macklin. Now, your faith is Green Dragon Mountain. Have you ever figured out what faith is?" Every word cut to the heart, every sentence harsh. Zhong Xiaoming looked at this man's face that she had never forgotten. She was in a daze and didn't say a word. She didn't argue, nor did she get angry. She pursed her lips and smiled. Two streams of sparkling and translucent tears slid down her cheeks as she smiled. She knew better than anyone what a warm and honest man he was, yet he said such harsh words. How deeply had she hurt him? How much suffering had she caused him? At this moment, the balcony door was pushed open again. "You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.